Hello and welcome back to one of my presentations about Slay the Spire 2. I hope you're enjoying the game. Today we're going to talk about a very basic question on the surface: what is consistency? And go quite in depth about many different aspects of consistency in the probabilistic sense around topics like density, compression, and smoothness. These topics, density, compression, and smoothness, I think have somewhat simple interpretations. You can feel it, and you can explain in short ways what they are, but the implications around them and the numbers around them can become quite complicated very quickly. And so we're going to go quite in depth on a lot of the mathematics of these today. And something that I would like you to be able to come away from this presentation with is a quite in-depth knowledge of these topics, density, compression, and smoothness, as well as a number of heuristics to work the learnings from our explorations here into your own gameplay, as well as, I think, getting a good grasp or feeling much more comfortable with some quite tricky concepts in probability and concepts in the game to wrap your head around. Some of the topics we'll discuss here are somewhat intractable to general analysis, and people rely on heuristics, or they rely on game theory, or they rely on reviewing their data, or reviewing many thousands of runs, or simulating the data, or taking samples to try and cover these topics, or find learnings or insights in them from observational data. And something I want to show you today is actual computation around these topics, as well as direct learnings that you can use to take those computations into your own gameplay and into your own understanding and into your own decisions when playing the game. So these are our three big measures of consistency in Slay the Spire: density and its related statistics, compression and related scaling discussion around it, and smoothness, which is, I think, something that people will understand intuitively if a deck runs smooth. It's quite hard to put your finger down on what it actually definitionally means, though, so I'll be giving you a definition for it today. And all of these topics are probabilistic. So there'll be a lot of discrete mathematics here, and a lot of the findings here are driven by probabilities. So you certainly don't need to have a strong sense of probability or discrete mathematics or graph theory or partition theory or anything like that to, I think, get a lot out of this presentation. We'll be taking it fairly slow. We'll be developing these ideas step by step. And so ideally, you'll be brought along for the ride. And of course, these are very difficult ideas to implement. So we'll also be deriving heuristics from the findings here so that you can rely on a heuristic rather than rely on a large amount of computation every single time you have a question about density or compression or smoothness. So we should address the starting question first, though. What is consistency? Consistency can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different players. People use the word in many different contexts, about games, about probabilities, about behaviors as well. And so maybe one of the ways to interpret consistency is that things are matching their expectations, or that things are going to plan. So drawing one specific card more often, or drawing combos together, is a way that the person might say that their deck is consistent. They always draw their two combo pieces together. Having more player agency might mean that something is more consistent. Players that dislike randomness might say that they prefer a game that's more consistent, that respects their player agency and responds to their player's skill. Playing a key card earlier in a run or earlier in a combat might be a way that the player describes consistency. They want that card to be in play all the time. Their deck operates on the assumption that card is in play. And so getting a key card down, like Echo Form or Domain or Tyranny, or using something like the Royal Stamp to give a crucial card innate, could be a way for a player to explain that the deck is gaining consistency by having a key card early. And having game actions and game behaviors match those player expectations, the fight going the way they plan the fight, the turns going the way they plan the turns, the outcomes being consistent with each other, poison always behaving the same way, and stunning always behaving the same way. These are ways that players could explain consistency in a game. The game sequences are going according to my plan. The way this run is playing out, the way this combo is playing out, the way this combat is playing out is going according to my expectations, and I'm able to express my agency as a player and express my skill as a player, not just in the turn by turn and not just in the decision by decision play, but also in the grander strategic play as well. Consistency might also mean avoiding game-ending situations. Now, this is maybe where the way I would use the term consistency maybe more or less falls down to. I might say that a decision is more consistent if it leads to fewer game-losing situations. So, things like reducing outcome variance. Rather than having outcomes relying on rolling a die, maybe you could show the player a series of options that are randomly generated, and then the player chooses from those random options. So there is still randomness involved, but the player gets to choose one with input variance, different options between what they're choosing between, rather than outcome variance. So that's why you could reduce outcome variance in a game design sense. You could also reduce outcome variance by just refusing to click cards that have random outcomes, right? Like there's a card Uproar in the game. Uproar has a random outcome. It plays a random card from the deck. You could also try and improve your worst case scenarios. So improving your worst case damage with a card like the Boot, or increasing your worst case block with a card like Crimson Mantle. You could have more redundancy with effects like Hologram, or with Dolly's Mirror giving you additional copies of a card, or you could have more relevant options to choose between with cards like Skim, or cards like Burning Pact, which let you draw more cards to your hand. More relevant options means that you can choose a stronger play pattern, thereby mitigating your worst case scenarios. And, if you've seen any of my videos, I talk about this kind of thing quite a lot. Reducing the likelihood that you are going to draw dead hands, making sure that your worst case scenarios, which you are just as likely to see as your best case scenarios in the vast majority of the time, your worst case scenarios aren't game ending. Because there are lots and lots and lots of ways to win the game, but there's typically only a few ways to lose the game. And so removing your likelihood, your exposure to those downside risks, by removing your worst case scenarios and by mitigating your risk in those senses, is a way to say, hey, I'm improving my consistency. Also, from just a game design perspective, you could say, well, we're reducing the number of feels bad moments. A feels bad moment in the game might be a situation where a player feels like they have played optimally, or according to the decision making that they have been able to make at every step along the way, they have been playing correctly, and yet they still got punished for that. Richard Garfield, I think, famously gave this example. Well, what if you play the game of chess and then you roll the d6, and if the d6 landed on 6, then whoever lost the game of chess actually won, and whoever won the game of chess actually lost. Well, 5 times out of 6, that chess game is representative of the skill of the two players, and chess has some variation in itself, who goes first and who goes second, and how much attention a player can play, and which player is more well rested and who ate more recently, and all those regular things that happen to people in competitive settings when athleticism and the human body is involved. Typically speaking, if we give chess the benefit of the doubt, and we'll say chess is a 100% skill-based game up until who plays black and who plays white, and that can also be part of the tournament structure. Having a die roll at the end of a game of chess where you did everything right and you won a fully strategic, full agency game, but still lost the game itself because of a die roll, would be a feels bad moment. And so reducing the incidence of those feels bad moments is a way to say, well, they're improving the consistency of the product. So consistency could also mean here avoiding game-ending situations. Consistency could also refer to a player's play style or their gameplay itself. Things like having a higher win rate. A person might say, oh, I want to consistently win more. What they're saying is they want to improve their win rate. Maybe they want to have lower run variance. They want to be able to win runs, even if the card rewards are worse according to their interpretation of the game. Or they want to make decisions in the same way. They want to work out what the best option is for a certain decision space, and then go back and make that same decision every single time. You might know that as like a meta game. A meta game is where there appears to be, you know, simmering to the top of the pile, these options that are the strongest possible strategies, and the strongest possible strategies that interact with each other at that top of the pile, at the top of the decision-making structure. And often in a constructed card game, that takes a very long time to work out what the meta game is, because there are so many arbitrarily large numbers of different combinations of cards that you could use in combination with each other, and it's actually, you know, often difficult to evaluate if one is actually better than the other. But you might say, for example, in a constructed deck building game, you know, I choose this deck, I want to play this deck because it has a more consistent matchup against the rest of the metagame. In the context of Slay the Spire, though, you might say, well, making the decisions the same way, players want to, you know, quote unquote solve the way that they handle different events that do offer them different options. So you see this all the time, you know, ancient relic tier lists, or what if I'm shown this combination of relics from Niao or Nanapipe or Oribos, you know, what's the tier list for these different options in terms of their quality? You know, can I find a way to make a decision that the majority of other players who also seem to be strong players also agree with the decision that I make and can defend the decision that I made? You know, that quote unquote solves the decision. So a player might choose a play style where they consistently make the decisions the same way each time. And, you know, very often that's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? A player makes similar decisions, you know, each and every time, so they arrive at similar looking game states, and so they develop the next decision, which is, you know, a similar decision in a similar game state in a similar way each time. In the sense of the draft, though, you know, in Slay the Spire, you might say, well, finding the same synergies. Players might try and always go for a particular synergy space, like they might always try and draft the Shiv keyword, or they might always try and draft Frost Orbs, or they might go to shops looking for a particular relic, or they might always go to particular events or particular shops, like they might always go to Act 2 events looking for apparitions. They might always go to as many shops as they can looking for a particular shop relic, like a data disk on the defect or something. And the game does respect this type of like approach. The game has lots of tools that give you more options on what to choose between. So the merchant lets you, you know, go into more shops and see more rewards in more shops. The Everlasting Candy lets you see more powers and get those power options. Driftwood lets you re-roll. Prayer Wheel lets you see an extra card reward, just like the Hunt lets you see an extra card reward. And the Orrery lets you see up to 5 card rewards, which, you know, will give you many chances to see the cards that you want to see with the keywords that you want to see. You know, I'll highlight Orichalcum for this one as well. In Slay the Spire 1, and, you know, to some extent in Slay the Spire 2, but I think maybe a little bit less so, a relatively common play pattern that you could do was to receive an Orichalcum as a common relic in Act 1 or in early Act 2, organize your map through Act 2 to go and find the Apparitions event, which was an Act 2 event in Slay the Spire 1. It's now a Varku Ancient reward, and then use Orichalcum and Apparitions to solve the block side of the game, to lean into whatever damage strategy that you wanted to, you know, on the Silent or on the Ironclad, or whichever character you're on, to be honest, because it was colorless. It was a colorless strategy. Orichalcum is a common colorless relic. It applies to all the characters, and the Apparitions event also appeared for all the characters. So it was a cross-class way to solve the block space of the game and let you focus almost entirely on damage and card draw. You know, maybe you've never played a particular run exactly like that, but when you play Slay the Spire 1 for, you know, 6, 7, 8 years, you do start to see that line appear a little bit more often. You recognize when you see Orichalcum in Act 1, you can go event shopping in Act 2, and so it's like an opportunity for players to express their skill. Having these kind of combinations in the game improves the number of ways that players can express strong skills of the game and increase their consistency overall as winning players. Again, though, those aren't the topics we'll be talking about today. Just to, I suppose, return to the start, we'll be talking about density and related statistics, which is a deck building statistic. We'll be talking about compression, which is a gameplay statistic, and we'll be talking about smoothness, which is a draw and deck order statistic. So yes, we will talk about a lot about probability and a lot about discrete maths here as well. Let's get stuck into the main body though. Deck density is a term that you may have heard around the Slay the Spire community. In essence, it refers to the proportion of your deck that outputs any particular given type. So you'll have your block density, you'll have your attack density, you'll have your power density, you'll have your status density. Block density is the one you'll hear about the most, because block density is important at almost every turn in the game, or at least the majority of turns in the game. Your block density refers to the proportion of your deck that generates block, or sometimes people use block density to mean your chance to draw block as well, although those two things aren't exactly the same. Just because 30% of your deck is block cards doesn't mean your 30% chance to draw a block hand. We'll go into those numbers a bit as well. You can also measure your status density, your scaling density, your star density on the regent, especially something that you might have, and you can visualize this as well, right? If you think of your deck of cards as a box, you have a deck of 25 cards, well, that's 5 hands of 5. Your density is the number of block cards that are distributed around that box, or that 5x5 box. If you have lower block density, maybe you only have 5 block cards, you're starting defends, and maybe you draft like a rage or something on the ironclad, so you have 5 block cards and everything else is attacks and powers. Or maybe you got like a True Grit and a Shrug It Off and a Feel No Pain and an Impervious as a rare roll, and the new Expect to Fight at uncommon as well, and so you ended up drafting a lot of block cards, and so your block density is quite high. In those 25 cards, maybe 12 or 15 of them are block cards. You can measure deck density as a direct percentage, so like a deck with 9 block cards and 23 total cards has a 39% block density, is something you could say. You could also measure other statistics about those cards though. You could look at, for example, all the cards in your deck that generate block, and you could say the deck's average block per block card is 7.5. Or you could look at all the cards in your deck and count all the block on all the cards in your deck and average it out over the entire deck and get a substantially lower block number. But you don't need to, right? Because if you have the density measurement, which is the number of cards in the deck that are block cards, and you have the average block measurement, you can put those two together and get a more specific statistic, a more granular and demonstrable statistic than just something like average over all cards, which has a lot of information kind of baked into it and lost in the noise. We can also measure the maximum block that can be generated at each energy rank, and not just each energy rank, but also potentially turn by turn as well. Maybe your energy goes up over a fight, or maybe you have plating which goes down over a fight. But you could say something like, this deck has 11 block capacity at 1 energy, 20 block capacity at 2 energy, and 27 block capacity at 3 energy. So for example, that might be a deck with like a Shrug It Off Plus, which blocks for 11, which you can play for 1 energy. And then at 2 energy, well, you have a Shrug It Off Plus, which gets you 11, and then maybe you have a True Grit Plus, which gets you 9, but you don't have a second Shrug It Off Plus. So you can't get 22 from 2 energy by just playing the same Shrug It Off twice. You got to play Shrug It Off, and then you got to play True Grit. Maybe you can only generate 7 block on your 3rd energy, and so over the course of 3 energy, you'll see that the amount of block you can produce per energy starts to run off. And of course, there are lots of ways to start to modify these kind of numbers at each stage. You could have something like Ripple Basin, which is an extra 4 free block if you don't play any attacks. So when you have big block turns going for 27 block, maybe you get Ripple Basin for free on top of that, 31. Whereas maybe if you block for 11 and play some attacks, Ripple Basin doesn't trigger. Or maybe at 2 energy or 3 energy, you could trigger something like the Snecko Helm here. Or maybe you could increase your block capacity for a particular turn by carrying 10 block over from a previous turn with a clamp. Now that's a very common way to want to approach the crab fight, right? The rocket crab comes to you for like 45, you turn and face it, you apply weak, you can have a clamp behind you, and then you can play like 3 defends, and that's a way to solve that kind of turn. Increasing your capacity to meet the crab claw or to meet the waterfall giant's explosion, for example. Capacity is what you want there for those particular fights, and there are lots of ways to improve your capacity when you do have to overcommit to blocking on a particular turn. And these particular numbers were very much the discussion in a previous video of mine if you want to go much more in depth on those. So we have these 3 values, right? Density, average, and capacity. And they can tell you a lot about a deck's output. A deck with high density and low average will generate block over many card plays, So Finesse, for example, gives you 4 block, but it costs 0. So it improves your density by having a finesse. It has a low average because it's a low number on a block card, but because it doesn't contribute to your energy expenditure, you can play it on top of other block effects if you do want to go higher. And, that improves your ability to block at 0, 1, 2, or 3 energy. But it does mean that your block is being distributed over more cards. A deck where the average and the capacity are close is a deck that has cards that are similar output. So for example, say, you were playing Prismatic Gem and you ended up with Shrug It Off, Gatherlight, Survivor, Grave Warden, and Glasswork Plus, something dumb like that, right? Like all 5 of these block cards produce exactly 8 block. So if you had these 5 block cards, that would be a case where you could say, I have exactly the same average and capacity, all my block cards generate exactly the same amount of block. And if I was to spend 2 or 3 or more energy on blocking, it would always be at a rate of 8 block for 1 energy. A deck that has low density and high capacity has a few block cards, but of high impact. And so if you were in a deck that had a lot of attacks and was very aggressive, and then you had, for example, the Gambit, or you had like an Impervious, that would be a deck that had low density, have very few block cards, very few block effects, but the block effects that you do have can generate a lot of block. So your capacity is still quite high, even though your density is quite low. Well, what does that mean for a deck in that way? Well, it means that you're still quite unlikely to draw the particular cards you need on the particular turns. Like if your block strategy is just a Gambit, you might not be able to make the Gambit against the Waterfall Explosion. You might not be able to make the Gambit against the Rocket Crab Claw. You probably have experienced that yourself. You look at your deck going into the Waterfall Giant. You have to kill the Waterfall Giant because you're trading lethal at some point. And then you look at your deck and you say to yourself, it looks like I'm going to draw a decent hand to block. And then you don't. You draw like defend, strike, Ascender's Bane. And you're able to block 10. And then it explodes for 43. And you take 33 and you die anyway. So density of those block effects is what you might need in that particular circumstance. Density in the deck, the remainder of the deck at least. But of course, this doesn't just apply to block, it applies to other effects as well. You might like to look at your attacks and you might like to say, how can I deal 27 damage in combination for a slime, for a corpse slug, or for a roach? How can I deal 28 damage in combination so that when I'm up against the Decimillipede, and the Decimillipede is reviving itself, I can draw combinations that can put down one of the arms of the Decimillipede back. You could look at the combination of cards in your deck and say, how can I deal 36 damage? That would be something you want to do. Look at your deck and say to yourself, how can I combine for 36 damage here to kill the books before they eat my max HP? And some notes on these statistics. Capacity is very often just the maximum value achievable by adding your cards together. So, Shrug It Off plus True Grit plus some other card. If you just take your 3 biggest block cards and put them together, that's often your capacity. You might add some zeros, you might have some finer points around, like other triggered effects, but usually it's just your biggest 3 cards. So the starter deck itself has 5, 10, or 15 block capacity at those 1, 2, or 3 energy stages respectively. That's the lowest it can go, without like Pandorazing into all attacks or something like that. And limiting your energy or your cards played is a way for the game to demand more capacity from you at all those energy levels. If you have like a Dance Macabre deck, and the game gives you 1 energy for the turn, maybe by putting like a void into your deck or something like that. Even if your best block capacity is at 2 energy and 3 energy and very low at 1 energy, maybe you have like a Grave Warden or something, by not allowing you to have access to the 2 energy play or the 3 energy play, the game is able to deal you a lot of damage over the top. Likewise, the Knowledge Demon will limit your number of cards played or the number of cards that you can draw, so you're much less likely to draw the combination of cards that you need to reach your maximum capacity of block. Likewise, the game could say that you don't get too many turns and it's pressuring your damage whilst it's also attacking you. And so we will look at this Thieving Hopper fight, I think, as well, because I think it's a good example. It's an easy pool fight in Act 2, so you fight it almost every single run. And it also is the same 5 steps for each and every combat. It always goes exactly the same way. So it's a good one to drill down on. One of the things I want to point out first here, though, is that if you only focus on improving your capacity, you limit the number of ways to actually draw these combinations. And by only focusing on improving your capacity, what I mean is if you were to try and draft so that you only take a card that's better than what's already in your deck, right? If you try and get through the game only drafting bigger block cards than what's already in your deck, your capacity will always stay the same. And even if you drafted weaker cards, you would still have the same capacity, right? You're not giving yourself more options to have a better hand. But what you are doing is you're removing yourself the option of constructing any of those weaker hands, maybe at 95% capacity, or maybe 90% capacity, or even 85% capacity in any number of ways. You know, in this example again of like Shrug It Off plus, True Grit plus, and another block card, if you only take block cards that are better than Shrug It Off plus, like Shrug It Off plus Nimble, or Impervious, or like Rage or something, right? You're going to limit your ability to ever draw those cards in combination. So sometimes a Shrug It Off minus could be the thing to do if you just need more coverage. Let's look at this Hopper fight though. The Hopper on turn 1 deals 19 damage, and then on turn 2 it gains Flutter and it gets up in the air. On turn 3 it deals 23 damage, on turn 4 it deals 16 damage, and then on turn 5 it escapes. So you can change its order a little bit depending on when you knock it out of the air. For the majority of fights, this is going to be the play pattern you see. And I've just chucked together some combination of cards here that, you know, I could have it at the beginning of Act 2 in a Regent run. On turn 1, I could play something like Bulwark and defend. On turn 2, I could deal damage. On turn 3, maybe my hand gives me Cloak of Stars, defend, and Pather. And then on turn 4, I use Sovereign Blade with a parry that I get to play somewhere else. And I play a Cosmic Indifference. And then I can put my Sovereign Blade back on top and play Sovereign Blade again on turn 5 when it's trying to escape. If you go through the fight in this way, you'll take 3 damage on these turns. You'll take 3 damage on turn 1. You'll take no damage on turn 2, and you'll take no damage on turn 3. Now, that's not guaranteed, of course. Like, what if I drafted the same cards and then drew them in a different order? Let's say on turn 1 I had Cloak of Stars and 2 defense, and then it fluttered and it dealt damage, and I dealt damage. And then on turn 3 we had Bulwark and Cosmic Indifference, and then turn 4 was the Pather and the parry play, and then turn 5 was the kill against the Hopper. Well, in this circumstance, just by drawing those cards in a slightly different order, now I have to take 6 damage as opposed to 3. And an exercise you could do here if you were to simulate this fight is to look at all the different draw orders and all the different permutations of hand that you could draw and try and find like a damage minimizing deck arrangement that lets you skip as many cards as you want to skip and take as many cards as you want to take. But the point here is just to say that by taking a variety of these effects, you know, Cloak of Stars, Bulwark, Cosmic Indifference, Pather, and Parry, they're 5 block cards that would have had to have been drafted into this deck, right? A lot of people might just stop at Bulwark or stop at Cloak of Stars, Pather and Cosmic Indifference and Parry being quite low rated on most people's, you know, tier lists or things like that. They make a big difference to the amount of damage that you take in this fight. Adding a new high output card is the most straightforward way to increase all of those metrics, density, average, and capacity in your deck all at the same time. And removing a card that you don't intend to play, like Strike or a Curse, can increase your density, but it doesn't actually affect your average block, and it doesn't increase your capacity to block either. You can enchant your highest output cards with something like Kafuda to increase your output capacity, or maybe if you attack something like the Hemming Axe, without increasing your density as well. These ways will increase your output for the deck that you already have. And maybe one of the things you could think about is that when you get these extra effects like Kafuda or the Oddly Smooth Stone for blocking, or like the Vajra or the Corrupted Eye or the Stone of All Time, your damage output, is that you can replace draft picks with these effects, or conversely, if you don't get these effects, you might need to take more draft picks. And by way of example, say for example you skipped on Parry and you skipped on Cosmic Indifference and you just played Defends instead, well, how's the Thieving Hopper fight looking now? By not drafting those cards, you expose yourself to a situation where you might only have Defends to play against the turn 323 hit. So you could play Pather Defend and then Triple Defend and then Bulwark Cloak of Stars. Take 13 damage after this fight. Even if you get a little bit luckier there and then it swaps the Bulwark to the best turn 2, you play Pather on turn 1, Defend on turn 1, Bulwark on turn 3 with Cloak of Stars, and then 3 Defends for the 16 hit, you're still taking 9. So drafting that Cosmic Indifference or drafting that Parry took you from a a damage space where you were taking potentially like 9 to 13 on the range there, down to between 3 and 6. So those draft picks saved 6 HP, 8 HP, something like that, right? And your average output per card, it is definitely a bit harder to pin down as there is a lot of information bound up in it. But adding block to non-block cards reduces the average output while increasing density. Adding strength increases your average damage per card, but it may increase your damage capacity even further with multi-hit attacks as well, right? Multi-hit scales with strength multiple times over. Or increase your capacity only a little if only 2 or 3 cost cards are already your best options. So if like you gave strength to a dash, it deals 1 more damage. So you get 1 more damage for your 1 strength over 2 energy. Whereas if you have a multi-hit attack like a pommel or like a sword boomerang, where you're getting 4 hits at 1 energy. So strength and dexterity can have very different like scaling factors depending on the cards in your deck and how much block they actually provide you or how much damage they actually provide you. But really, when we're talking about increasing the average output of your cards, it almost always only comes from relics. Because if we were to add a card to our deck like a footwork or like an inflame or like a prowess to improve our strength in our decks via a power, we're decreasing our density to do that. We're adding a power to the deck, which means we're decreasing the attack density and we're decreasing the block density. But let's look again at the grasshopper fight, and you can see the strength of even something like an oddly smooth stone. So this is the arrangement that was dealing us 13 damage previously. They're on defend on turn 1, and then triple defend on turn 3, and then bulwark and cloak of stars on turn 4. With an oddly smooth stone, you're now taking 9 damage in this fight, whereas previously it was dealing 13. So the oddly smooth stone is saving 4 HP there. And we'll look at the same thing again. Say, for example, you did draw the bulwark on the best turn, on that turn 3 for it, and you got patter defend turn 1, bulwark, cloak of stars turn 3, and then triple defend on turn 4. Well, with the oddly smooth stone, you're only taking 4 damage now compared to 9 damage without the oddly smooth stone. So in that circumstance, it saves 5 HP. And what were we saying? Those card picks, Cosmic Indifference and Parry, were likely to save. They were going to save something like between the 6 and 8 range. So an oddly smooth stone saving between 4 and 5 is quite comparable to taking in those draft picks. Now maybe you could get the best of both worlds. Maybe you could take the parry and you could take the oddly smooth stone. So it's maybe a fairly like isolated example, but I hope it does kind of demonstrate that sometimes card picks can be equivalent to a strong relic. Increasing the dexterity of all of your block cards can be equivalent to adding a few good block cards to your deck and just giving yourself the opportunity to draw them, because it all comes out in the HP at the end of the day. These particular statistics, density and average and capacity, they're most useful for understanding and evaluating large portions of your deck, the meat and potato kind of stuff, right? Your block cards, your scaling effects, your utility packages, your damage, your ability to kill an individual mob like one of the books. It can get fairly hazy if we try and look a bit closer. Just while we're at this kind of top level though, this is a table or a graph of the likelihood to draw a hand of less than 2 good cards in a typical hand of 5 cards. Across the top is your deck size, so your total number of cards, 15 cards, 20 cards, 25 cards, and running down the left hand side here is the number of cards in your deck you would consider quote unquote good. In the case of trying to block, something like the Waterfall Giant's Explosion, you count all of your block cards as good cards, right? So if, for example, you had a 22 card deck and you had 5 block cards, including your starting defense, which is unironically like a fairly common place for a deck to be at the end of Act 1, you might have like a 69 or 70% chance to draw less than 2 block cards in any individual hand. Now, let's say you did draft for the fact that you're in the underdogs a little bit closer and you drafted with the sense that the Waterfall Giant was at the end of the act, and maybe you have 22 cards and you have 11 block cards. Well, now there's only an 11% chance that you wouldn't actually draw a hand with 3 block cards when the Waterfall Giant goes to explode. And you can check your deck as you go through to see, is my block density still relatively high? Do I have the option of killing the Waterfall Giant on a particular turn so that my next hand has the highest likelihood possible? Maybe you kill the Waterfall Giant when you have 10 cards left in your deck, and 6 of them are block cards, well then 1 in 50, you're not going to be able to spend all of your energy on block. The likelihood that you spend all of your energy on blocking the Waterfall Giant Explosion in that circumstance is 98% of the time. Now maybe your HP is fairly low and you need to draw specific block cards to survive the hit. Maybe you need to draw weak. Maybe you need to draw an impervious that you've been saving, or a gambit that you've been saving, or a panic button that you've been saving. In those circumstances, density doesn't really give you too much detail, because when you start looking at 1 or 2 or 3 cards, density very much falls apart. It's just the number of cards, right? is just however many you have. What are some early learnings we can take away from talking about these 3 particular kinds of consistency though? Density, capacity, and average output. Well, output. If a pick has as much output as your 3rd best card, consider adding it. It'll increase your capacity when you do add it to your deck. It'll increase your density when you add it to your deck. And it will increase your average output when you add it to your deck as well. So you'll be ticking all 3 of these stats off. If the 3rd best attack in your deck is strike, or if the 3rd best block in your deck is defend, just add anything that's shown to you and it will improve. And yeah, I do mean anything, because small differences do matter. Small differences in block and damage output on those individual cards do become chip damage or missed lethals. Looking again over that grasshopper fight, those weak cards, the parry and the cosmic difference, even though they were the weak cards, by improving the density and giving you options other than defend, they saved to 6 HP. So even though there's only a small difference on the number of the card, when it comes to the actual amount of damage that you take over the top of that, that can make rather big differences over the course of the entire fight. Now at the top end, capacity is the limit. If an enemy attacks for more than you could ever block, damage is always going to be guaranteed. So improving your capacity, your block capacity or damage capacity all along the way through the run is a really good idea. That doesn't mean that you have to take like Berry, if Berry is shown to you just because it's the biggest damage card. Look at your deck and say, hey, how much damage can I deal for 3 energy? Maybe your deck can already deal more energy for 3 than you could with the bludgeon, or than you could with like a reap. Those cards that have high compression, just on themselves, they deal a lot of damage for the 1 card, but maybe it's not actually going to improve the capacity of your deck to deal 36 damage or 35 damage in one particular turn. We can also try and improve the density of our cards with mixed output cards. Mixed output cards that provide more than one type of output increase your density along both types of output, allowing for more combinations of plays. If you're looking at that graph and you're thinking to yourself, how can I maximize the number of ways that I can deal damage? How can I draw 3 block cards? Iron Wave starts to look pretty good. Fisticuff starts to look pretty good. Dash starts to look really good. And Dash is a great example because 2 cost cards also provide more density for the card addition. You can think about a 2 cost card as almost like drawing an extra effect of the same card. Every time you draw a 2 cost block card, it's like you drew 2 1 cost block cards, right? So there's some virtual card draw in there for free. We often talk about Make It So as a card that can come into your hand free without needing to draw it. But actually, every 2 cost card is kind of a free card draw. If you draw a 2 cost card like Dash and you didn't draw Defend alongside it, and Dash is the way you're blocking, Dash drew 2 Defends, right? So you can get that virtual free card advantage there in those higher cost cards as well. The flip side of that is the free effects. Output that doesn't require energy can be drawn with other high quality cards to block massive hits or one-shot those fights. So something like Backstab or something like Anger or Poke on the Necrobinder. These effects let you improve your output so that you can get more done in one turn in combination with your other effects. So whereas a 2 cost card disproportionately improves your density, free effects improve your capacity. They improve your maximum capacity so long as you would draw those free effects in combination with your other cards. And maybe something that I have heard a couple of people say, just discussing the game, is that when they have 2 cost cards, they want to lean into 2 cost cards for their dance and for their helm. And when they have 0 cost cards, they want to lean into 0 cost cards for their wrist blade or for their all for one. But actually 2 cost cards and free effects go the best together, because 3 effects of virtual energy and 2 cost effects of virtual draw and energy are complementary, and so putting 0 costs and 2 costs in the same deck is actually better for both of them. They're complementary to each other, not antagonistic. Of course, as mentioned, these are meat and potato kind of stats for a deck. There's edge cases that'll break them down as well. You know, if you have Daughter of the Wind, all of your attack cards now count for 1 block. So your block density is very high because every attack counts as a block card as well, but your average output is very low because those cards only prevent 1 damage. A deck that only has 1 block card has the same average and capacity. So, you know, looking at your average and looking at your capacity doesn't necessarily mean the deck can do that much every single turn. If there's only actually 1 effect in the deck, you know, you can only draw it once. If you only have 1 impervious, you can only play it once. A deck with low density might never draw its highest capacity hand. You know, if you only have 3 block effects in a deck, and you do need to draw all those together, and you have very little card draw to support them, you know, no Battle Trance or no Centennial Puzzle or no Swift Potion, your capacity to actually output the amount of block that you need to output for a particular turn, even though you have the capacity there, the likelihood that you ever draw it together might be simply too low to consider, you know? Earlier I discarded a 2% chance as like something not necessarily worth consideration. Well, in a lot of circumstances, your likelihood to draw 3 cards in combination is going to be like 2 or 3%. So bear that in mind. You need to get those numbers high, maybe high enough, higher than 10% or 15% to actually start to consider them reliable. You know, most fights in the game don't go for 10 turns. And so a 10% chance might still not appear over the course of a fight. The Phantom attacks you on turn 3 and then on turn 7 with a big attack. And so if you intend to block those big attacks, you need to be able to output that 30 block on turn 3 and then on turn 7. So you need to have a very high likelihood of being able to produce 30 block on any given turn. And then straight up, some cards are not directly comparable. Echo Form and Compact, they both improve your scaling. Echo Form doubles the first card you play each turn. It's effectively card draw and energy every single turn. And it gives you the option to double your biggest effect every turn. So it maximizes your output. It takes the best thing you can do and does it again. Compact transforms all the statuses in your hand into fuel. But that can save you a lot of HP if you transform Withers, or if you transform Parasites, or if you transform Burns. But nowhere on those 2 effects do they actually overlap with each other, right? Compact saves your worst hands full of Withers, and Echo Form doubles your best effect in your deck. So they're kind of operating at extreme ends of the spectrum there. And there are lots and lots and lots of other ways to kind of ruin these numbers, like ruin these statistics as clean, reliable stats. Usually, though, they're ruined in a way that's at least positive, in the sense that if you ignore this extra output, or if you ignore this extra effect and kind of take your density and your average as lower bounds, you can still work with them as lower bounds. But something like, for example, Bone Flute makes all your Rusty attacks generate extra block, and Ornamental Fan, all your regular attacks extra block. If you ignore these in your deck construction and still have a good block plan, well, they'll only make your block plan even better. Part of the skill of the game is trying to assess exactly how much you can incorporate them into your block plan. How many cards can you skip, or how far should you lean into Osti attacks because you got Bone Flute? You know, how many weak defensive cards can you skip? Can you skip something like Cosmic Indifference because you got Ornamental Fan, for example? Obviously, I don't have those answers right now. Those are very, very run dependent, and part of the skill of the game and part of the enjoyment of the game is kind of assessing these on a case-by-case basis as you go. And, you know, we've barely touched on powers at all. Powers and scaling from powers can be very difficult to understand within the framework of density, because powers affect the cards that come after them. Typically, they'll have lower impact on the turn that they're played. They cost energy on the turn that they're played, almost always. And so because you do have less energy on the turn you play them, you typically need to play a power alongside a higher capacity hand. So if you draw all your powers together, you might only get to play one of them, or you might play multiple of them and just have to face tank a lot of damage to do that. It's also better to draw them earlier in the fight, because then you get the advantage of their modifier over more turns and more card plays, And all of this same reasoning applies to stars and Sathuses and summon and upgrades and exhaust as well, right? The earlier you exhaust an effect, the more times you avoid drawing it. The earlier you get your stars, the more likely it is that you get to actually play the star costing cards that you draw. If you get, 12 stars by the bottom of your draw pile, because you got to go Cache into Venerate into Royal Gamble, or it doesn't really matter if you skipped playing your Comet and you skipped playing your 7 stars to get to that point. Deck ordering matters here as well. And so powers are a part of the game, and scaling in general, cards like armaments as well, they're a part of a game that respects the order of your deck quite a lot. And then the enemies in the game themselves, they throw different questions to you every single turn. And so both sides of the game have this kind of changing clock, what cards you're going to draw and what's the enemy going to do. And something like a power on a turn where you have to full block is very different from a power on a turn when you're not under any threat whatsoever, and you do just get to deploy powers and play attacks for no additional damage. In that kind of circumstance, you want to look towards the end of the fight. How fast can I end it? And you're comparing an attack to a power in that circumstance. But for the majority of hands, you're comparing a power to a defend. And so for the majority of the time, powers will cost HP to get down. How much HP they cost to get down depends on when you draw them, what the enemy's intent is, and how much of the fight you have left to fight. One of the ways that we can try and normalize the effect of powers is to look at our full deck cycles. You go through your full cycle of your deck, you reshuffle, all the powers that you played are now in play, and all the cards in your deck are now affected by that power for the next shuffle. It's not very granular, and it definitely takes a big sweeping hit at the whole thing, but it's an estimate. For the purposes of output, your second cycle through your deck, when your powers are already deployed, you want it to have higher block, attack, and status density because those powers and your exhaust cards are gone. They're no longer being redrawn. You want to have higher block density due to playing out synergizing powers to trigger more block. You want to have higher average stats due to playing out your strength and dexterity and transforming cards. Your hands should be better. All of your cards should have more output. That doesn't mean that your capacity is necessarily going to be improved, though. Sometimes when you get to second cycle, your capacity is actually reduced. You might need to spend single-use effects like Glam or like Exhaust to get through the first cycle. If a backstab is the best way to improve the damage output of your deck, for example, that only works on turn 1. Trying to draw a backflip through the second cycle through your deck, occasionally it happens extremely rarely, but under normal play circumstances, the second cycle through your deck that doesn't have backstab in it is going to have lower damage capacity than your turn 1 with the backstabs. We can bridge that gap though, so let's look between scaling and density and output. Cards have a variety of output numbers for their costs, and scaling effects improve our output for the same cards, and a deck that plays out their synergizing powers can reconsider its good and bad cards as they scale, right? Every turn they can look into their deck and they can say, hey, my defense block for 8 now, my basic strikes come in for 9. So they can look at different combinations of cards, for the turns they have coming up. Decks that do have a lot of powers can eventually trivialize fights. It doesn't matter what cards they draw, they're going to draw hands that can deal with whatever the game throws at them because they've simply outscaled all those aspects of the game. And mixed output powers especially scale your output and your density at the same time. Something like Juggernaut, for example, can improve your damage on the back of your block density. And then you could play effects like Fasten or Molten Cloak or Plating to improve your block output and your damage output at the same time. Something like Child of the Stars. What are your star cards typically doing on the Regent, especially at higher rarities? A lot of the time your star cards are big attacks. 7 stars or Comet or Devastate. And so Child of the Stars lets you generate block whilst playing your big attack cards. Also on the Regent, Spectrum Shift and Pillars of Creation. Pillars of Creation gives you block whilst you're creating new cards. You're increasing your choices, you're improving the quality of your deck, whilst also generating block at the same time. So you're scaling both your output and you're scaling your density of quality cards by creating colorless cards to play with. We do have a word for these varieties of advantages due to drafting high output cards and scaling our effects up. It's called compression. So compression is a term that's heavily connected to Android Netrunner. It's another card game, an LCG, a living card game, which I expect had a really significant impact on Slay the Spire. I know the game devs of Slay the Spire were long-time Netrunner fans, and even in recent interviews they were talking about StimHack, which was a Netrunner forum that was maintained by the Slay the Spire devs. I also am a long-time player of Android Netrunner, and I see a lot of the same parallels in the games. In particular, though, when it comes to compression, what is compression? In Netrunner, turns are measured in clicks. So you would call out your turn, click 1, click 2, click 3, click 4. The runner, who is a hacker thematically, has 4 clicks on their turn, and a corporation who's trying to deploy their agenda without being hacked by the runner, they have 3 clicks. And that was a consistency across the game almost all the time. Clicks can be spent on those game actions, and almost all the game actions take at least 1 click, with many of them requiring 2 or 3. So just as an easy example, professional contacts here, it's a resource, so it works similar to a power in Slay the Spire, and it says click, gain 1 credit, and draw 1 card. Credits in Netrunner are kind of like stars on the region. It's like a resource that carries over from turn to turn. And normally in Netrunner, you can either click for 1 credit or you can click for 1 card. So Professional Contacts is a 5 cost power that lets you double the quality of your energy. So maybe a comparable card would be something like Echo Form, right? Echo Form is a card that takes up your entire turn, and it doubles a card per play every single turn. Professional Contacts is kind of similar to that. It's taking the majority of your resources. 5 credits is quite a lot. You probably are committing a whole turn or potentially multiple turns to playing Professional Contacts, but what it's doing is it's doubling your click compression. Now, instead of taking 1 credit or instead of taking 1 card, you get both. Another example is Melange Mining Corp. Melange Mining Corp is an asset. It's a corporation card, so it's played by the corp player. What they have to do is they have to put the Melange Mining Corp into a server. They have to play it down in play, and the runner can interact with it. And so the corporation might need to prevent this card from being interacted with like a piece of ice or something, right? Like some block, essentially. But what it says is click, 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 gain 7 credits. And so again, just like with Professional Contacts, the corp also has the ability to spend 1 click for 1 credit. What's this one saying? Well, instead of getting click, click, click for 3 credits, you can get 7. So it's giving you more than double the amount of compression. All of these clicks are now worth 2.3 credits instead of the regular 1. And that's how resource advantage goes in Netrunner. It's mostly from click compression. You can't reliably get more clicks, and most effects in the game are similarly costed to each other. So what you're looking for ways to get more resources per click, get more out of the clicks that you've got. Energy is just very, very, very similar. 3 energy per turn, 3 clicks per turn. All the cards in Slay the Spire are balanced around something like a defend plus or a strike plus. Most of the time, any block card you draft is going to give you like 8 block, or maybe 10 if you upgrade it. Most of the attacks that you draft are going to give you like 10 damage or 9 damage, maybe 13 to 15 if you upgrade them. It's very difficult in Slay the Spire to get more than that kind of range out of your energy. And that's why cards like Hidden Gem and Silken Trez are so important, right? So powerful, because they give you the ability to double one of your effects. Same with Echo Form. They give you the ability to double one of your effects in a game that normally only gives you a little bit of leeway. The difference between the strong cards and the bad and the weak cards in terms of their raw numbers is very, very, very marginal. So in Slay the Spire, you can think about this as energy compression. And we can take that very Melvin-y approach to consider the game as like a combination of strikes and defends. Like a defend plus is 1.6 times a defend. A spiral defend is 3.2 times a defend. A defy is 1.2 of a defend plus, 0.25 of the enemy attack back as block from the weak. When you give your card, +1 dexterity from an oddly smooth stone, it's kind of like adding 1/5 of a defend to every single time you block. And sometimes you get to increase your output regardless of your energy, right? Like if you have frost orbs are +0.4 of a defend. And they carry through turn by turn. They're always active without any further investment. You can invest more to evoke them and get more out of them, and you can invest more with things like defragment to get more out of them, but they will just keep ticking away. Now, a power like Spirit of Ash applies that compression to a card like Defy. Defy is 1.2 defense and weak, but then Spirit of Ash makes it 1.8 defense and weak. And this weak as well, scales with how much you're being attacked for. So it's really quite easy for Defy, especially if you can buff it with Dexterity or with Spirit of Ash in any way. It's quite easy for Defy to be worth more than 2 defense. Of course, Spiral Defend Plus is always worth more than 3 defense. Like, the Spiral Defend is just insane. So these aren't obvious ways, or I think really even necessarily useful ways to evaluate cards on a pick-by-pick basis, but it is a way that we can, from the outset, evaluate cards, especially very strange cards that maybe have odd effects that are hard to incorporate into other ideas, but we can kind of do our best to standardize these effects against other cards and, compare and contrast. And this kind of efficiency, this transformation or recontextualization of these effects as, some combination of strike and defend, also still ignores like card draw, right? Like Dash is here, 1.6 strikes plus 2 defends. What it's not showing you is that it's also plus 1 card. So, this is a very limited scope as well. But a little bit of standardization has a lot of utility. Let's look at some easy hallway fights. They typically ask for between 2 or 3 defense for most turns, but will still chip you damage. So the Tunneler asks for 15 or 26, that's either 3 defense or 5 and a little bit defense. I almost call them the Jawworm. The Nibbler asks for 13 or 7 or 16 or 10. So you're playing 2 defends, 1 defend, 3 defends, or 2 defends and taking some chip damage over the top. The Corpse Slugs attack you for 6 plus 8 with Frail, and your defense can sometimes be only worth 3 when they do it. So Frail decreases the quality of your defend in that circumstance, and you end up needing to produce like almost 5 defense worth of block from a hallway fight because of the Frail. Starting with, like from Niao, an extra block or damage option to navigate these fights can save over 5 HP in all of these floor, and you do that 4 times and all of a sudden you can take a Forge instead of a Rest, and then your deck gets better. This is what people call the snowball effect, right? Letting your deck gets better saves you HP, and then you can Forge and you can make your deck better again. If you save an average of 5 HP over the course of 3 hallway fights, 3 easy pull and then 1 hard pull fight, that is, what a Rest is going to be worth most of the time, somewhere between 19 and 23 HP, right? And we can apply the same reasoning all the way up to the end of the game. Late elites and bosses are soft cap at between 40 to 60 effective block requirement. It can get higher in extreme cases, like when the queen is fully frail and fully vulnerable against you. So the queen here does 4 base damage, plus 2 times her strength, and then that's times 5. And you're affected by Frail, and you're affected by Vuln. The Vuln gives her a damage multiplier of an additional 50%, which is kind of like saying that your block cards are 2/3 as effective, and the Frail obviously prevents you from blocking. It reduces your block numbers by 25%. So together, you're effectively 50% on your block. So it will attack you for 40, but you have to put out 40 worth of block, or 60 or 80 worth of block to actually block that because of the Frail and the Vulnerable together. The Eye has similar numbers. The Mechanite has similar numbers as well. The Mechanite will also attack your hand while it does it. It'll give you 4 burns, and so if you're overdrawing or if you're retaining cards, you'll get fewer cards to work with the next turn effectively. And it'll pressure you to make up that block with fewer card plays because your hand is now full of burns. You can't just backflip through them. But what these bosses are asking for is somewhere in the range of like 12 defense worth of output. So 4 defense compression per energy for the typical deck. What did we see earlier? How do you approach that kind of number? That's like saying you need to play 4 copies of Spiral Defend with a footwork in play. That's really quite a lot. But we can get there. Our scaling effects, our powers, our relics, our debuffs, our exhausting, like high front load premium exhausting effects, they all improve our deck on the second cycle or on the first cycle after those powers come down. We can naively estimate how much output changes in the second cycle once those single-use exhaust cards are spent and the powers are deployed and the attributes are applied as well. Some of our powers will even give us multipliers, so not just linear improvements like from dexterity, they'll actually give us an even bigger number like from unmovable, which will give us a ×2. Spiral gives us a ×2. Glam gives us a ×2. And a lot of those effects will just improve our flat output as we go through the other motions, right? Like Feel No Pain. Feel No Pain will give you an extra 3 or 4 block every time you exhaust a card. And so as you're going through the deck and playing your exhausting effects, like True Grit, well now True Grit goes from 9 block to 12 block or 13 block, right? Add in any decks to that, add in unmovable to that, and all of a sudden you're looking at something like 22 or 23 block from one common. You could go even bigger on the Ironclad these days. You can do Second Wind. Second Wind triggers Feel No Pain each time, and it triggers all of its exhaust from the unmovable as well. So you could Second Wind 3 cards and get 39 block out of it, right? And now with the new version of Expectify, Ironclad actually gets even more dexterity scaling on Expectify, right? Because dexterity affects all of those procs as well. That could be, if you have a couple of attacks in hand, 40 or 45 or 50 block from one card. For 3 energy, mind you, but from one card. Here's an example deck that Erebus DL posted to the Reddit. It's a Necrobinder deck. They won against the Aeon Glass and the test subject at Ascension 10. And it actually looks like a very strange run as they go. So they started with the Shears for 2 card removes. They got the Tungsten Rod in Act 1 and then straight to Pael's Tears into the Act 2 hallway chest for a pendulum, directly into the Sigh from Tank. So they actually only got the chests in Act 1 and Act 2. Act 3, though, they exploded. They got all these relics in Act 3. They got a bunch of max HP, they got a good amount of upgrades, they got a good amount of energy, they got a flat output as well. They also got the Shuriken for strength scaling, although of course Necrobinder doesn't really like strength scaling that much. And a couple of boat thingies as well to go with the Sigh. So it looks like a very, very tough run, but when they did get to Act 3, they kind of just popped off with it. You can see as well, they didn't even get an Act 2 shop after their treasure map. They had to wait all the way until floor 4 after 3 fights in Act 3 to get their shop. But then they did get the 3 shops throughout the act, which is where they got all these relics. Towards the end of the game here, though, the deck only really has 2 card draw effect after everything. They've got a bag of preparation and they've got the pendulum. There are plenty of card generation resources still, however. They've got Call of the Void, they've got Creative AI, they've got Domain. They got a couple of ways to tidy up the redraw with Cleanse and Sculpting Strike. They can feed out the Wisps, and also there's 10 ethereal cards in there as well. So if they don't need to play those ethereal cards, they can just let them expire from the deck. 5 copies of Defy. So if you ever wonder why Defy has such a high pick rate, look at runs like this one who are taking 5 copies. Wisps and the Happy Flower support the energy, the boat thingies and the Tungsten Rod and the Sigh, and then 100 max HP as well really support that deployment of all these powers. This deck doesn't really need too many card draw resources because it has all this per turn block and it has enough max HP that even if it draws dead, it can take a hit every now and then. If we include this extra energy and the card draw that is here, the deck can spend 6 turns worth of energy in a 5 cycle deck, mostly on powers and blocking. So that's a +1 turn acceleration. Over the course of 6 turns, they can compress it down to 5 turns. On top of that turn of compression, they're also getting a lot of value added to their energy they expend. They've got Domain to give them the extra energy and extra card draw in the first place, and they're also improving the compression on that energy with Spirit of Ash and with Slider Flesh, free damage and free block every time they spend energy. Every Defy, is almost 2 defends worth of output, and it's dealing a bunch of damage. And they also have a level of inevitability here as well, right? Call of the Void, Creative AI are going to create more powers. Creative AI will be creating more Dance Macabre, more Spirit of Ash, more Shroud, effects that can add block to card plays in other ways. Even after turn 3, when the boat thingies are expired, they've got the Bone Flute here with Right Hand. So as they're playing their 2-cost powers, Slay the Flesh and Domain and Creative AI, right-hand is coming back. 3 card plays for the Bone Flute. So that's kind of like building your own permafrost, right? They're getting block as they play out their powers because their powers are expensive. And at the front side of this deck, when looking at this deck, it's quite slow, it's quite cumbersome, it's a 6-cycle deck, it takes 5 turns to deploy everything. They've got end of days as well, so if they are up against a fight that's going to be a bit more concerning to them, they can just end of days through it, like a basic hallway fight against the books or against the gunner. End of days will do the job. The Spirit of Ash here is allowing each Defy to compress almost 2 defends and weak. And with Spirit of Ash, the Enfeebling Touch is getting a free defend attached to it as well as 8 strength down on those hits. So against something like the Test Subject, which has Phase 2 and Phase 3, all with multi-hit effects and all with very, very large damage numbers, both weak on Defy and the Enfeebling Touch there is incredibly strong. The Slay the Flesh adds more than 2 strikes worth of damage to each debuff cast. Almost every card creates a debuff, and so if you compare that to something like Demon Form or something like Serpent Form, how much damage would you need Serpent Form to be doing to get 2 strikes worth of damage out of every card play? You would need 3 Serpent Forms, right? How much strength would you need to get an extra 2 strikes worth out of every card play? You would need 12 strength. So Slay the Flesh is adding a lot of compression to all of these effects that apply debuffs, and most of the cards in this deck can apply a debuff, especially on the second cycle. On the second cycle, this deck can continue to play a power every turn while playing 2 to 3 defensive cards, triggering Spirit of Ash and Slay the Flesh as it goes. Every Spirit of Ash trigger is basically a defend. Every Slay the Flesh trigger is basically 2 strikes. And so there's 3 energy worth of basics for free here every time a card is played, and it can go up to 4 energy per turn, so you're kind of getting 12 basics worth of effect every turn for free because of this energy compression on these powers. And this isn't like too abnormal, right? Like I'm talking it up like, oh, there's all these extra basics to play. Most decks, so as you deploy your powers and as you deploy your relics, most decks will scale to this level of output, if not higher. That said, Creative AI on the Necrobinder is kind of ridiculous. I don't think any of the bosses in the game would ever actually threaten a build like this, right? But with that kind of approach, we can start to define something like a compression ratio, like a number that describes how effective energy expenditure is compared to just playing basic strikes and defense. A compression ratio for a deck goes down as high compression exhausted cards are expended. You know, your Blade Dancers, your Imperviouses, your Backstabs, your Boot Sequences. And it goes up as energy is invested into scaling. And so what kind of number would we give the deck that we were just talking about? As mentioned, you kind of got 3 basics on top of the cards you are already playing. Maybe a card you draft is worth like 1.5 basics. And then the free like virtual basics that you got on top there, the strikes and defends, was worth about 3. And so it's something like 4.5 compression ratio, maybe slightly higher, maybe slightly lower, depending on exactly which cards you exhaust and exactly which cards you create with a Creative AI, but it only goes up from there. But on the topic of sign, on the topic of the boat thingies, like not all scaling that we play will provide increases to our energy compression. A lot of the relics and the powers that we play will provide output at a flat rate, regardless of the energy that we invest. Some of these relics and powers will provide card draw or energy without modifying our output at all. Now, more energy means more output, of course, and more card draw means more options, which means we can play more quality cards and less lower quality cards. But, you know, most players will find themselves in situations occasionally where drawing more cards won't improve the turn that they could play. And most players will find themselves in situations eventually where giving them more energy won't actually improve the quality of their hand. They're already capped on energy, or they've already drawn 0 cost effects, or the card that they're playing with their extra energy doesn't actually save them any HP. Likewise, if you add dexterity, or if you add an unmovable, but you don't actually have a card that says create block on it, that doesn't actually help you scale. They can be very turn dependent, and you know, if your compression is high enough, it doesn't ever feel turn dependent because the likelihood that you don't draw defend cards is negligible. But in a lot of circumstances, it is worth considering that you want these extra effects, right? Pillar of Creation, Coolant, Cloak Clasp, Sigh, or the Nutritious Soup for damage as well, right? Nutritious Soup gives you free damage as you cycle through your deck on the strikes. You can think about these extra outputs, these flat outputs, as insurance. Similar to max HP, similar to drawing extra cards, they improve the bottom of your output. They improve the minimum of what you can be doing. Orichalcum is a perfect example again. You're always going to have at least 6 block. These incompressible outputs also have an extra utility of resisting negative compression debuffs. Now that we're working with this notion that compression is something you can be doing for your cards, well, if we look around, the game is also providing us negative compression. The game is attacking our ability to compress as well. The Queen fight especially highlights this effect. By applying 99 Vulnerable and 99 Frailty, your block cards are effectively minus 50% before rounding down, and often that rounding down can be quite severe as well. So, you might lose 2 or 3 block effectively from a block card because of the effect of rounding. What does the Queen fight demand that you have? It demands that you have these effects like Anchor, or like Pillar of Creation, or like Cloak Clasp. It demands that you have effects like Weaken, because Weaken always works. It's a flat change, and the bigger the number they're attacking you with, like when you're vulnerable, the more impact Weak has. And maybe just to highlight like the 50% effect here, Boot Sequence versus Anchor. Imagine you are being attacked for 10, you have the Anchor or you have the Boot Sequence. Anchor gives you 10 block, and you're being attacked for 10. Great, fine and dandy, blocks that. Boot Sequence will do it as well, but now imagine that you've got Vulnerable and Frailty as well. Now your Boot Sequence blocks for 7, and you're being attacked for 15, so you need to play 2 Boot Sequences, or twice as many Boot Sequences. They're 50% as effective against what should be a base attack of 10 because of Frailty and because of Vulnerable, and actually rounding costs you another point there. So these flat output cards that you can't scale infinitely with Dexterity and that you can't scale infinitely with more card plays, they can still be very powerful because they're incompressible in the opposite direction as well. They can't be debuffed from you. Maybe something interesting to point out is that Pillar of Creation is a very powerful card on the Regent, but Coolant is a somewhat mid card, or somewhat underrated card, I think, on the Defect. Why is that? The Defect already has Frost Orbs. Coolant, at the start of your turn, gain 2 block for each unique orb you have. Coolant is effectively saying all of your orbs kind of behave like Frost as well. Now, maybe if you're making the decision on if you should evoke a Frost for a Lightning Orb, Coolant says you can evoke the Frost, the Lightning will behave like a Frost. Your first orb of each kind is like a Frost on top of it. Of course, though, the Defect just loves playing with Frost and playing with Focus, so something like Coolant is in a utility space that most players don't want to venture into, where they're not necessarily playing with a lot of Frost. Whereas Pillar of Creation on the Regent is the play space that most players do want to venture into, because the Regent has a very, very complicated deck building paradigm. It's very difficult to understand if you should or shouldn't be adding cards to your deck as the Regent, because a lot of heuristics don't apply because of things like additional compression constraints on stars and additional ordering complexity from stars and powers at the same time. And Pillar of Creation lets you ignore a lot of those in favor of card generation, with additional card draw and card generation being a very powerful way to circumvent the Regent's key drawbacks, the Regent's key weaknesses to do with the complexities of the deck arrangement. I also don't think it's unfair to say that a lot of players, and especially new players, underestimate how many cards they need to add to their deck to have coverage of a lot of fights and a lot of effects, especially before they learn all the fights and learn all the effects, and especially as they lack experience with each individual card. So card generation at random, just putting those cards into the player's hands, regardless of whether they would skip them or take them, gets over a hump where the player is not expressing player skill by drafting more variety of silver bullet effects, just simply because they don't know that they should do that. Card creation gets over that hump by just putting those cards in their hand and giving them extra effects on top of it. So why a player might think, oh, I'm playing Spectrum Shift so I can get 3 or 4 block per turn for free out of Pillar of Creation. Spectrum Shift is also feeding them cards that they would never draft, and getting them over a skill hurdle as well there. So that's density and compression. Let's talk about the third idea here, smoothness. A deck that is smooth is a deck that can spend more energy on its best cards. The idea is that the smooth deck is less likely to boom and bust. And maybe some motivation around this is you might hear people say, for example, that they bottom decked their good cards, or that they drew their deck upside down, or that they overdrew on powers. Phrases like this. Smoothness is going to refer to your hands, and it's different from density. And we're going to aggregate smoothness over the course of many hands, over the course of the expression of the whole deck. I'm sure any listener and any player has a notion of feeling a sense that when they say the deck is running smoothly or the deck isn't running smoothly, what that means. It's much more difficult to quantify the idea, but that's what I'm going to attempt to do today. Some behaviors we would expect of a smooth deck, maybe just to get started and describe what we do describe as smooth. Adding a high quality card should probably make a deck smoother. Adding a low quality card should probably make your deck less smooth. You know, you're more likely to draw a hand with bad cards in it. You're more likely to look at the hand and say, oh, I don't like that. Drawing more cards should increase smoothness of the hand. So as you draw 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 cards, you should be able to have more options there and play higher quality cards and feel like you're always getting to play the effects that you want to play every single turn. And increasing energy should also increase the smoothness of your hand, because you'll have to have less contentious decision points. If you have enough energy to just play all the quality cards in your hand, you can say, well, the deck's running smoothly, I don't have to make any tough decisions. Maybe one of the things that the players count as an unsmooth is when I have to make a tough decision on what particular effect to play. And to smooth a deck can cycle faster. We might look to say, hey, I want to redraw this effect again, or we might look to say, I'm guaranteed to draw this card by turn 3 or turn 4, or guaranteed to draw it by turn 5. Well, if the bottom of your deck is 7 turns away, and the fight may very well be over by then, a player might win the fight or lose the fight within like 7 turns without seeing the card on the bottom of the deck and feel that their deck wasn't running correctly, their deck didn't run smoothly because it had a key card in it that they wanted to play. So cycling faster should make the deck smoother. With those ideas in mind, we're going to model it here. So we can model a deck as a grid of squares. Each row represents a new hand of cards, and we'll say that there are enough rows to cycle through the deck. So for example, this grid represents 15 cards, 3 hands of 5. If we color our good cards green, we can draw an arrangement of our cards in the deck by coloring in the grid. So in this coloring of the grid here, we have 5 good cards on our first hand, 1 good card in our second hand, 4 bad cards in our second hand, and then 5 bad cards on our third hand. This is a diagram that we would call steep or top heavy. You drew all your good cards together and then all your bad cards together. And since you only have 3 energy per turn, this type of draw actually doesn't play all of our good cards. You'd say you've got 6 good cards in this 15 card deck, but then over the course of 3 turns, you actually only got to play 4 of them. Because you only have 3 energy per turn, you actually only got to play these 4 good cards, and you didn't get to play these last 2. Well, let's just reorganize the green cards, right? This graph also colors our good cards green. We get to spend our energy on 2 good cards per turn and 1 bad card per turn, but by doing that, we get to play all 6 of our good cards over the course of 3 turns, as opposed to the previous graph where we only got to play 4 of them. While it's the same number of cards, 6 good cards being, typical of the starter deck and 4 draft picks, this arrangement is much more flat. You can play all of the cards you've drafted as well as the best cards in your starter deck. So those are the 2 ideas here, flat and steep. A steep arrangement, you can't play your quality cards because you drew them all together. You drew a hand of all basics and a hand of all quality, and you were limited by energy. Or a flat arrangement here where you drew them all spread out, and every turn you got to express all of your energy on the drafted cards each turn. Notice though, for the same deck here, we can arrange the good cards into each row of the grid. We can't put more than 5 cards in a row here because it's only 5 slots wide, and we can't make it bigger than 3 rows because after 15 cards, you reshuffle the deck, right? And so that would represent a deck bigger than the one that we have. It would take more turns to draw through the bigger deck than we actually have. The mathematical term for this is called a partition, and what we're representing over here on the left-hand side is called a Young diagram, or it's a variation of a Young diagram. We're taking a partition of the number 6 good cards, and we're distributing those 6 good cards over 3 turns. Each turn has a maximum of 5 cards, so we can partition the number 6 into up to 3 parts, with each part being at most 5. So 5 plus 1, 2 plus 4, 4 plus 1 plus 1, 3 plus 3, and 2 plus 2 plus 2. These are all partitions of the number 6 that meet our criteria here. And there is a limit to the number of ways you can partition a number. So for example, you can't split 6 into more parts than it is ones. Like 6 is 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. So you can't break it up into more than 6 individual parts of 1 each. There is a function that counts the possible number of partitions of a number n. It's called the partition function, P of n, as you might expect. But we're not going to use the partition function here because we have additional constraints. More specifically than all the possible partitions, we're limited by the cards per turn, so the width of the graph here, 5. We're also limited by the number of hands before reshuffling, which is the height of 3. We have 2 restrictions. We have a restriction on the number of parts. We also have a restriction on the size of the individual parts. And this type of doubly restricted diagram is called a bounded Young diagram. Our diagram here of good cards is inscribed in the rectangle of M by K. So M being 5 good cards and K parts, 3 hands. So any partition that we wanted to make of our good cards would have to be a Young diagram that fit within this bounded area. And by modeling the desired cards as a bounded partition, we can start to answer all the questions about the deck to do with ordering and distribution as well. So with this model, what we're going to do is we're going to find the possible partitions of a deck. We're going to decide if the partitions are smooth or not. We're going to analyze the likelihood that the deck is in the arrangement, in a smooth arrangement or a non-smooth arrangement. And we're going to derive a way to describe smoothness overall of a deck. Again, a hand being smooth or a deck arrangement being smooth is specific to its actual arrangement. But what we're going to do is we're going to look across all of those and look at aggregates. Let's start by enumerating partitions though. So for a partition lambda of n with k or fewer parts, each to a maximum of m, so our bounded partitions that we're after there, the p of lambda, which is the number of partitions that can be taken of this n within this bounded criteria, so the number of different arrangements that our deck can be with, some number of good cards and some number of total cards in the deck, that's equal to the nth coefficient of what's called the Gaussian binomial with k and m. So k is the number of hands it takes to cycle, the number of hands we'll draw before we reshuffle. M is the number of cards per turn. It's going to be 5 the majority of the time. Sometimes it might be 6 if we have Pael's blood or something like that. These Gaussian binomial coefficient terms can be expanded as a geometric series, so you can actually just evaluate them as geometric series if you're familiar with that. And these Gaussian binomial coefficients have an impervious kind of equation here, 1 minus q to the power of m, factored with 1 minus q to the power of m minus 1, all the way through to 1 minus q to the m minus r minus plus 1. It looks a lot like a factorial, right? Between m and r, m choose r, looks like this, where you count the sequence down, m times m minus 1 times n minus 2, all the way down to m minus r plus 1. But instead of multiplying the terms together, you're taking them as the roots of some polynomial. And what this is doing is, rather than counting permutations of, m objects, or if you were to draw r objects from m objects, what it's doing is it's counting the number of different ways to choose subspaces of a dimensional space, which has a lot of applications in linear algebra, especially higher dimensional applications for linear algebra. Say for example, if you're into large language models and vectorized representations of tokens, this Gaussian binomial coefficient is something that you might start to look at as a way to count the number of different ways that a tokenized word represented in a vectorized embedding could have different meanings, for example. So it's quite niche, but it does apply in our circumstance here. It does happen to be exactly the same number we're after here though, which is the number of bounded partitions for a deck size n with hands k of hand size m. We look at the nth coefficient after expanding that form. And a brief explanation on how to do that with like a geometric series. A geometric series is a potentially infinite length polynomial, incrementing in the powers of some variable x. So it looks like this: 1 plus x to the k, plus x to the k squared, plus x to the k cubed. So, you know, xk is your replaceable term here. And when x is in the range of 0, 1, this actually converges. It's not infinite. What you can do is you can take more and more and more terms, and the terms limit to this form here, 1 on 1 minus x to the k. So when we're calculating the Gaussian binomial coefficient function, we can treat the calculation as a multiplication of these geometric series and then expand the factors. And here's an example for a 20 card deck. So let's take a 20 card deck. We've got all of our basics. There are 4 strikes, there are 4 defense. We've got our 2 other starter cards like Bodyguard, and then we've got our Ascender's Bane. And then on top of that, we've got 9 drafted cards. So we've got this Q binomial, 9, 4, with k equals 4 and m equals 5. Then what you do is you pair up these terms. We've got this q to the 9 term here. We'll pair that with the q to the 3 term. We've got the q to the 8 term. We'll pair that with the q to the 4 term. We've got our q6. We'll pair that with the q squared. And then we've got our q7. This one's a prime, so we'll pair it with 1 minus q, just for the prime there. That helps us eliminate them all down, and we expand the terms. And we get this rather long thing here. It actually flips and just counts itself back down. So 1 plus q plus 2 plus 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 11, 11, 12. But then it goes back down the other way. 11, 11, 9, 8, 6, 5, 3, 2, 1. And then this leading term here is actually 1 plus q to the 0. So this is a 0 term, right? But what do we say? We have 9 drafted cards. So we take the 9th coefficient, and the 9th coefficient is 11. And what this number means is that there are 11 ways to permute 9 cards through a 20 card deck. And so now that we know that there are 11, we can just describe them all. There are 11 ways to partition 9 drafted cards over 4 hands and 5 cards. Well, I say 9 drafted, but there's also our 2 starter cards, so actually 11. There are 11 ways to partition 11 drafted cards over 4 hands and 5 cards. We did see that those terms were symmetric though, so around the center, 9 and 11 have the same coefficient. In these draw orders, there are hands that are entirely drafted cards, and there are hands that are entirely starter cards, and these partitions, again, they're called steep. We have a new term for you here, a Dyson rank. The Dyson rank of a partition is taken as the size of the largest part minus the number of parts. So for example, these 2 diagrams here, at the top, they have a rank of 5 minus 3. There are 5 cards here. There are 5 green cards in the top rank, and then we only have 3 to choose from. So in this 20 card deck, this has a rank of 2. This one as well, this is 5 and 3. So even though these have different arrangements of the actual cards, you can see that this first hand has 5 good cards, 5 good cards, 1 good card, 4 bad cards, 5 bad cards, whereas this one has 5, 4, 2. The rank is still 2. These ones down here at the bottom, they have a rank of 5 minus 3, so it's still 2. Now this one is 5 minus 4, so it's a rank of 1. So because we spread the 11 good cards out over 4 total hands, even though one of the hands was all quality cards, the rank is still down to 1. As we distribute the drafted cards over more hands, we see that the Dyson rank decreases further. So this top row here has 5 minus 4, which is a rank of 1 as well. This is a rank of 4 minus 3, which is a rank of 1. This one here, it's a rank of 4 minus 4, so it's a rank 0. And this here is rank 0 as well. So you can see as the rank is decreasing, typically speaking, we get to play more of our green cards because the green cards are spread over more hands. It's not 1-to-1, it's not exact, but that's kind of the movement that we're going with here. We can also describe the shape of a partition by counting the 1s and the 0s. So there's this term omega. Omega lambda in partition theory is taken to be the number of parts of a partition that have size 1. Because we're working in a bounded space, we can modify that, and we can say that it's going to be equal to the number of parts that are equal to 1 or the number of parts that are equal to 0. So that there's a term there, omega 0 lambda, and these are the number of dead hands. So we have a term within partition theory that we can modify to count the number of dead hands when we model our hands and model the deck this way. which is one of the reasons it's powerful to like model things mathematically like this, because you get to borrow from the field. As we distribute the cards over the hands, we have the Dyson rank decreasing further. This top one here has a Dyson rank of 1. This one, however, has a Dyson rank of -1, and this one has a Dyson rank of 0. But we can see that this hand of -1 has all of the 11 quality cards played over the course of our deck. Let's incorporate that. Let's mirror that construction a little bit. From density, we can consider the energy that we're spending on our preferred cards. So let's count the green nodes in the leftmost 3 by K columns here on the left-hand side to represent playing up to 3 of our priority cards on any given turn. We'll define a new term here, surplus. Surplus is the number of preferred cards that your deck order can afford to play. So that's like the number of green tiles in the leftmost 3 columns here. So here in this arrangement, we get to play all 11 of our cards because they're all to the left of this 3. This one here, though, we only get to play 9 of our cards. This one here, we get to play 10 of our cards. Now, obviously, this matches the way I like to think about the game a lot. I'm always trying to avoid playing strikes and avoid playing defense. Just do anything to make sure I don't need to play those, and everything else kind of falls into place, to be honest. Here's a summary of those 11 arrangements of 11 cards and 20. And I've just enumerated here the Dyson rank, the number of dead hands, and the surplus. And we see that when the Dyson rank is highest, so this one, for example, with Dyson rank 2, when the Dyson rank is highest, the surplus is the lowest at -5. This hand has 5 energy spent on basics. This deck, this arrangement of cards over here has 3 energy spent on basics. This one has 3 energy spent on basics as well. And so the surplus comes through at -3. Which arrangements of the deck spend the most energy on non-basics? Well, they're over here with the highest surplus. This one's -2 surplus with Dyson rank 0. This one's -1 surplus with Dyson rank -1. Dyson rank 0 doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed to spend all of your energy on quality cards. So we actually can't, right? Like unless one of the quality cards in this deck is a 2 cost, we can't actually spend 12 energy over 4 turns on quality cards. We're definitely playing like a strike or a defend at some point. But now that we have these 11, we can graph them. So these are the partition metrics for a deck of 20 cards with 11 green cards, 3 energy and 5 card hands. So the blue line here is the Dyson rank. The red line is the number of dead hands that permutation of cards has. And the yellow line is the surplus, the amount of energy that you play on basics like strikes and defend. Or, to put it the other way around, the amount of energy that you get to play on quality cards, except the surplus is negative, so you're missing playing quality cards. You'll see that they just tend to together. The higher the Dyson rank, the lower the surplus. And it's not particularly like they don't move together all the time. There's a little bit of noise, but they move together, typically speaking. That doesn't sound too surprising to anyone. If you draw all of your good cards over the course of the entire fight, you get to play more of them. If you draw them all together and then you draw all basics in the next hand, you don't get to play with your good cards. Like, everyone knows that. So this is just kind of describing and enumerating and modeling the behavior still. We haven't learnt anything yet. We can start to learn something though. This table calculates the number of ways to draw a hand with so many bad cards and so many good cards. So we can start to look at this as a probability problem, right? This equation is for a hypergeometric function or a hypergeometric distribution. We've talked about that a number of times in my previous videos about deck size and previous videos about drawing dead hands. You can use this hypergeometric function a lot to calculate the likelihood of drawing certain combinations of cards. For each row in a Young diagram, we can read the value for that number as good or bad cards and multiply each of them together. And as we read from the row, we can move that value from the remaining cards, right? So as you draw 5 good cards, we can look to the next hand. So this first hand here, we're saying, well, 20, choose 5 good cards. What's the likelihood of that? And then we go to the next hand down, 15 cards remaining, choose 5 good cards. What's the likelihood of that? Go to the next hand down, 10 cards remaining, choose 1 quality card, 4 low quality cards. Go to the next hand down, 5, choose 5. So the bottom hand is always guaranteed because we're just going to go from top to bottom. when we do that, we can see the likelihood that the deck is ordered in this particular way with this particular partition. Now, I've not presented that these hands could be in different orders. I've presented them just in terms of the Young diagram, with their largest number first, the second largest number second, the third largest number third. But you can absolutely permute these as well. So, for example, this is an arrangement with 5 quality cards, then 1 quality and 4 basics, and then 5 quality again, and then a dead hand. So for this arrangement 5-5-1-0, you can permute it a number of ways itself. The algebra is absolutely a mess, essentially due to the independence of the hypergeometric distribution. What I can tell you as a learning is that each of these deck orders is equally likely. So the order in which you draw the hands of a particular arrangement of a deck are equally likely. I mean, that doesn't sound too shocking, but we just can prove it in the algebra as well. Like the mathematics supports that when we model it in partitions with this way. So if you have a deck arrangement that's a 5-5-1-0 partition, you're just as likely to draw 5-1-5-0 as you are 5-0-1-5, as you are 1-5-0-5, as you are 1-5-5-0. So all those permutations are equally likely. That definitely gets messier when we start talking about reshuffles, but when we're talking about 5 card hands with a perfect cycle, that does still apply. And here's the likelihood of those 11 permutations of the deck that we're talking about. So a 20 card deck with all of our basics, Ascender's Bane, 2 good starter cards, 9 drafted quality cards. These are the likelihoods that you draw a deck of this partitioning order. So this one here, there's a 0.04% chance, so we're talking about 4 10,000ths of a chance that you draw this deck order 5-5-1-0. There's a slightly less than 1% chance, 0.71% chance that you draw this partition 5-3-3-0. Now, obviously underneath that, there's all the chances that you draw these 4 hands in any particular order. There's 24 different ways to draw these 4 hands. But the likelihood that you do have one of those 24 is 4 10,000ths. But what I want you to notice again is that these very extreme examples with very steep surpluses right here, like the very steep graphs, actually have fairly low chances to be drawn. So the likelihood that you do draw a hand of all 5 good cards, these 4 arrangements here on the left-hand side, all of them are less than 1%. What's much more likely is over here. The -3 surplus is 2% of the time. This -3 surplus of 5-3-2-1 is 7% of the time. This one here, we're getting into the double digits now. So this permutation 4-3-3-1 happens 17 or 18% of the time. Right up until here, this arrangement 4-3-2-2 happens 35% of the time. And so what we can do is we can weight the surplus according to its likelihood to happen and take an expected value, right? Expected value, the probabilistic expected value is the value times its likelihood to occur summed across all events. There are 11 arrangements here, and we have their probability and we have their surplus derivation. And if we were to look at this deck, a 20 card deck with 11 good cards, the expected value of the surplus is -2. So just to put that back in Slay the Spire terms, when you have a deck with 20 cards and 11 drafted cards, you expect that you will need to play a strike or a defend twice. You need to play a basic twice rather than a drafted card as you cycle through that deck. Here's that graphed out again. So we have the Dyson rank here in blue and we have the surplus here in yellow, and you can see them tending towards the same area. But let's look at the weighted surplus. So when we multiply by the probabilities of the surplus, you can see that on the red line here, although the yellow is out in the -4, -5s, it just snaps back to the 0 line. And actually it sticks really, really close to the 0 line up until you get to the flat, the low, up until you get to like the low rank permutations. So the probabilistic mass of the surplus is over here right down at the bottom, right around the 0 line, with the negative Dyson ranks and the 0 Dyson ranks. So to phrase this like differently probabilistically, you would expect a deck to shuffle around a Dyson rank of 0 for this particular number of cards. And here's some slightly different numbers. Let's say we've got some quality transforms on this deck, and we went from 11 good cards to 12 good cards, or 13 good cards, or 14 good cards. What's the expected surplus of that particular deck? Well, if we have 12 good cards in 20, 47% of the time we're going to draw a petition 4332. And if we get up to 13 cards, well, now 40% of the time we're going to get 4423. 25% of the time we're going to get 3442. And the expected surplus is actually going up. Right now it's negative 1.4. We kind of anticipate we're going to play one strike or one defend, and half the time we play another one. But there's this really nice tipping point here when we get to 14 good cards. Now, in most circumstances, we're going to roll an arrangement of the cards where we can spend all of our energy on quality cards every turn. And the expected value of the surplus is minus 0.01. So we expect there to be a 1% chance that we would have to play a basic 1% of the time as we go through our entire deck, where we have a hand that a third energy gets spent on a basic. So with this approach, you can calculate the expected surplus values for combinations where the total deck size was those multiples of 5, where there was no like reshuffling involved. So because the deck was empty on the final hand, there was no reshuffle involved. It's really quite difficult to fill in the gaps though with this approach. And let's be real, like without filling in the gaps, there's really nothing too shocking in this here graph. What this graph is the number of good cards across the top, or the number of green cards across the top, and the number of red cards down the side. And we're counting the green cards as the cards we would like to play. So for the total number of cards in your deck, you sum those together. For example, this point here, negative 1.2, this is 5 plus 5, it's a 10 card deck. And decks on the same diagonal have the same size. So as you move across to the next diagonal, it's like adding a card to the deck, the next diagonal, add a card to the deck. Because these are the numbers where the deck was empty at the bottom of the last hand, the next hand along is like an extra cycle to the deck, right? So these are 1 cycle decks, this is a 2 cycle deck, this is a 3 cycle deck. What are we seeing? We're seeing that if your deck has more bad cards, your surplus goes down further than if your deck has more good cards and it approaches 0. I mean, that makes perfect sense. Unless you add more energy to your deck, you're always going to be capped out at playing all of your good cards. So it's like not surprising at all. The downsides of bad cards are uncapped, whereas the upsides of good cards are capped. Like that's fairly normal, I think. This existing procedure, though, can be taken for decks with exact number of turn cycles, so where the deck is empty in the last hand. And the process as a step-by-step is that the generated petitions are deduplicated, they're permuted, and they're mapped onto the representative hypergeometric experiments, and then calculated as a sequence of experimental results. And hypergeometric experimental results are independent. So the surplus of the petition is calculated and then weighted with the probabilistic mass, so like the surplus times the likelihood for that petition to occur, and then the expected surplus of the deck is the sum of all of those weighted values. And so expected surplus will be like a major term in the definition of smoothness that I'm going to arrive at here. Let's have a go at an intermediary deck size. So far, the main tool for enumerating petitions of the deck has been this Q binomial coefficient. I use this over and over and over again to make sure that I was enumerating all the petitions correctly. However, they don't apply for non-squared inscriptions. So I tried to iterate up with separate cases from the bottom cards of the deck, put a bad card in the bottom, put a good card in the bottom. I treated the appended card as either good or bad and appended it to the bottom of a bounded Young diagram. And then I would weight the sum to the probability of bottom decking that particular card. That did let me get a bit of an inductive thing going. However, it couldn't fill out all spaces because there were lots of arrangements where like I couldn't induct because there wasn't a term to induct from. And it looks like it works for them, but it actually becomes extremely complicated very, very quickly. Every time you add an extra card to the deck, there's an extra layer of cases to handle. And then you're getting into, permutations of those cards as well and different arrangements of those cards as well. Also, it doesn't account for the rest of the new hand, just for the bottom decked cards. And also, I was actually counting one more card than was around, buried in the weightings, because I was counting full deck size and then I was adding one card to the bottom, and then I was taking the full deck size again as an iterative approach, so that bottom card was being added iteratively each time, one more time than it needed to be. So the error term was also growing to like a power of 2. the error term was also growing to like a factor of the powers of 2. Every time I iterated, I was doubling the number of events, and that was doubling the number of cards that were being kind of hidden in the weightings there. So in the end, I just decided to refactor the process and go back to basics. I rewrote the script I was using for permutations, and I just took a computational approach as opposed to a theoretical approach. And because I was working in Google Sheets, I used like a JavaScript with the Spreadsheets app module to read and update the sheets while avoiding running into memory issues and operation limits that exist in Sheets. Up until this point, I'd been using like custom formulas in Sheets. So what does the script do? The script takes Young diagrams as inputs. It takes a number n, and then it takes a diagram K1, K2, K3, K4, K5, so the number of elements in each row of the Young diagram. The script ingests this diagram, applies all the same recursive steps for generating all the partitions, but it's restricted piecewise to the partitions K1, K2, K3, rather than just a flat limit, rather than just K by M. So it's still bounded, but now it's bounded to a Young diagram itself, as opposed to being bounded to just a square. And so this new script would enumerate all the inscribed sub-diagrams of the input Young diagram. So you put in this Young diagram with the blue, and then one of the outputs would be this Young diagram in the green, and it's necessarily like an inscription that's necessarily inside the larger one. And this worked really well. The recursive bounding formula based on Q binomials and such was really useful for a theoretical approach, but it simply couldn't handle the number of cases, and like everything in Slay the Spire, it depends. So taking a kind of like theoretical breadth first approach got really hazy really quickly. So with the new script, how do I handle the bottom of the deck? Well, I take a second order iterative approach. Since this method does consider all the permutations of the partitions, you can treat the bottom cards of the deck with certainty. You know exactly how many cards of each type, green and red, are going to be on the bottom. By the time you've drawn all the other cards, the bottom deck is known information, and given the bottom cut of the deck is known, we can then also count the number of good and bad cards in the bottom hand. We can subtract those from the total deck number, call that the reshuffle, the new deck, and then we can draw those 2 or 3 or 4 remaining cards from the new deck and analyze the new hand probabilistically as well. So the steps are: check the number of good and bad cards in the bottom hand, subtract those from the final deck count, probabilistically weight the new sub-hand from the new deck, and count the surplus, including the new hands as well. And so just to summarize the entire process here, we're starting with partitions for a given number n, the number of quality cards in your deck, with the parts K1, K2, K3, the number of hands you draw to cycle, each of them with maximum part size M1, M2, M3, with the number of cards you draw each turn. The script is enumerating all the partitions lambda of n, satisfying part and size restrictions piecewise. These models are drawing n green cards in K hands of size M each hand. Each generated partition is then passed through a custom Excel equation to enumerate an array of all the permutations of the partition. If you only have 3 hands, it's quite short. If you have 5 hands, it starts to get a bit long. If you have an 8-cycle deck, it starts to get pretty ridiculous. But this array is then deduped. It's appended to a table of all the permutations of all the partitions of the deck, and then I check for the legality of them. Each generated permutation is checked against the bounding Young diagram once again to ensure that the hand remains legal. So after I take the partition and then permute it around, it's entirely possible it will no longer be legal, right? Maybe the partition draws 5 cards, 5 quality cards on hand 1, but then there's only 1 card on the bottom deck, and this permutation puts 5 good cards in 1 bottom decked hand, which isn't possible because, you know, there's only 1 card. 5 cards equals 1 card. Maybe there's like a bag of preparation turn, right? And now I'm putting 7 quality hands in an all drafted bag of prep hand into a regular hand for turn, so it's an illegal arrangement. So this validates the variable hand sizes, and it validates the inclusion of things like bag of prep or reshuffles mid-hand and pendulum and things like that. Then for all of these permutations of all of the partitions, we can assess the probabilities of them. So the first and second order probabilities of each permutation are derived. The first order probability is the hypergeometric model of the deck in its order. The second order probability is the hypergeometric model applied to one hand of the new deck. It's a smaller hand and it has fewer cards to choose from. But we do need to take a second order approach here, because whilst each first order permutation of an individual partition is equally likely, going back to earlier, it didn't matter how we permuted the hands, 5, 5, 1, 0. All that mattered was that we did have an arrangement, like a steep stack of 5, 5, 1, 0. However, because the new deck that we're drawing from when we reshuffle is modified by the cards we have on the bottom of the deck already, the second order probabilities do depend on the final hand. So we do need to take it both. There's a final hand model, and then there's the deck partition model as well. And then from those, we take the net surplus. The expected surplus is derived as a weighted sum of the surplus of each possible deck ordering. This step includes calculating the surplus in a handwise fashion. So this step can also be where we mix in other effects, extra energy, 2-cost cards, extra card draw, things like that. And here's the graph. So this graph shows the average net surplus for a deck of green and red cards for 3 energy. The table saturates negative red values at -9, and neutral is uncolored at -3. And then the positive green values are at +3. So this graph actually doesn't include any numbers that are above 0. All these numbers are below 0 because we aren't adding any additional energy to the deck. But there's a lot to see. We can see that if you only have a few good cards, adding cards will almost always let you play them. So how do you add cards to this deck? You simply move to the right. If you add a good card, you move to the right. If you add a bad card, you move down. And what we can see is that, say you start, for example, with the Regent starter deck, right? The Regent has 4 strikes, 4 defends, 2 other starter cards, and then the Ascender's Bane. And so we'll say that one of the Regent starter cards is worth playing, like Fallen Star, right? So we've got 10 bad cards and 1 good card. So the Regent starts here at -8. And as we add cards, again, adding good cards is moving to the right on this particular graph. It goes to -7, then -6, then -4.7, and then -4. So as you add 1, 2, 3, 4 good cards to the deck, this expected surplus, the net surplus, goes from -8 to -4. So if you add 4 good cards to your deck as the Regent, you can play 4 good cards. And that's kind of just true across the board. If you look at, like, if you move from left to right for any of these up until you get to a new deck cycle, when you add any drafted card to your deck early in the draft, when most of your deck is basics, you expect to be able to play every card you draft. And maybe this can clarify for some people why, like, you can just look at the deck and see that it has a lot of damage or a lot of block. Because when your deck only has a couple of drafted cards, you just assume that you're going to play all of them in 3 or 4 cycles respectively. So this is a 1, 2, 3 cycle deck with 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 cards. So this is a 15 card deck here. So over the course of 3 cycles, you're going to play these 4 drafted cards plus some amount of strikes and plus some amount of defense. So if you're to ask the question, hey, I've had 4 draft picks, how do I know if my deck needs damage, or how do I know if my deck has a lot of block? You can literally just look at them. You're going to play these 4. Right? You can just count them up and compare them to just playing strikes, or you can count them up and compare them to just playing defense. At the other end of the spectrum here, you can see that if you are adding quality cards to a deck that already has all quality, it's just zeros all the way down, right? Like, these numbers don't change at all. And this respects our game sense as well, right? Like, when your deck is already good, diminishing returns kicks in, and adding another good card that's comparable to the rest of your cards doesn't necessarily make it, like, better. You would need to add a card that's above the rest. You would need to knock something out of the priority order of play to be improving your deck in that way. So adding redundant effects, adding redundant kind of card quality to your deck after you already expect to play almost no strikes and almost no defense cycling through your deck doesn't really improve your energy expenditure. You're still just spending all of your energy on non-basics. It doesn't get better than that, right? we can see that there's this kind of interesting wave formation though. Down the small deck end here, it's a little bit hazy because the probabilities are kind of dominated by small changes in the total number of cards. But as you get into 2 and 3 deck cycles, it starts to be a bit more apparent here. You've kind of got this wave like so, and you've got another one here, and you've got another one here, and another one here. This diagonal through is when you have an equal number of good and bad cards, but you can see though that this kind of wave formation is gradually pushing the green up above that diagonal. So this reflects the fact that, you know, bad cards have more impact on your deck than good cards in a lot of the circumstances. The downside risk is uncapped, whereas the upside risk is limited. And you can also see with this wave formation that this is every time you would reshuffle your deck. So these diagonals here are going from 5 cards to 11 cards, and then 20 cards to 21 cards, and then 25 cards to 26 cards. So this is every time you would have a reshuffle of the next hand. Spreading your green cards out over the extra turn of hands does expose the deck ordering to both flatter hands and only having 2 greens over hands earlier in the ordering, and also exposes you to having more red cards in the reshuffle as well. So I did mention way back at some point that, like, smoothness, if you have a smaller deck that recycles and reshuffles less often, it'll probably be smoother, and this is represented here in the numbers. And you know, if you do take your deck to an extra turn before cycling, you do see that there's this negative shock to the expected surplus of the deck. So adding a card and going from like a 4-cycle deck to a 5-cycle deck could mean that you, even if you had a good card, could mean that you need to play, you know, 2 more strikes or 2 more defends through the cycle, just because now you have a lot more exposure, a lot more probabilistic exposure to drawing good cards spread out in hands where you would only have 2 good cards to choose from. So I'm going to refer to this as a bottom deck effect, where a deck has 1 or 2 cards more than an exact cycle, and this bottom cut results in these cards being drawn a turn later than if the deck was slightly smaller. But the bottom deck effect is really pronounced when you have more than 6 cards, when you can typically expect a new cycle to be -2 surplus. So anything under this range here, anything underneath that range here, you can see that the effect of going to the next deck cycle is roughly -2. So this is -1.9, this is -2 here, this is -1.6. As your deck gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the quality of going to the next cycle, the shock of it gets worse. But by the same token, you also have diminishing returns on the quality of your deck by adding more good cards. So those kind of play against each other. And you can see here, for example, a deck with 17 good cards and 10 bad cards, 17 green, 10 red. It's almost as likely, like it has a similar expected surplus to a deck with 21 good cards and 10 bad cards, 21 green, 10 red. So even though there are 1, 2, 3, 4 more quality cards in this deck than this deck, you don't actually get to play those 4 good cards. The 4 good cards are just options. And maybe that's a positive as well. Maybe you can read that and you can say, hey, I can take 4 draft picks and go from, you know, a 5-cycle deck to a 6-cycle deck. It won't actually matter. Like, I won't have to play any more strikes or defense. My hand quality won't go down by jamming in like 4 more cards. And that is the question. When should you take cards that are below average, right? So this graph shows the change in expected net surplus by adding a green card, a card you would play to your deck. You can see that for the starter deck, you expect to play every single card you add. Like, so just down here, when your deck is bad, everything is 1. Anytime you add a card, you expect to play that card. Instead of a strike or a defense, the surplus goes up by 1. Over here on the right-hand side, though, you do get diminishing returns from that impact, and there are lots of cases where you can see that adding a card actually makes it more likely that you would have to play strikes or defend. Your surplus goes down, and this is the bottom deck effect at play, right? When a card reward would cause you to have an extra turn and go plus on the cycle, You can't expect to be able to play all the cards that you've drafted due to the hand partitioning over all of those cycles anymore. That said though, even though like a drafted card can reduce your surplus, once you do have a deck of 26 cards or 31 cards or 36 cards and you are in that bottom deck position, mediocre commons can also improve your hand and improve your surplus quite substantially as well. This is also where you get the biggest improvement, right? So after the shock comes the biggest improvement. What's the lesson here? Well, with that in mind, you can consider drafting a mediocre card when you're early in the run. You probably should just not click skip until you kind of get past this good card, until you at least get past this diagonal, right? Don't click skip until you pass this diagonal. You probably don't want to click skip and just take mediocre cards until you're about here. 10 good cards, 10 bad cards. Or maybe with a Sender's Bane here, 11 good cards, 11 bad cards. At this point, you can see that like most of the adjustment of extra cards is like less than +1. So you can be a bit more picky. So like between 20 cards to 22 cards in deck at higher ascensions, you probably should just take every card you see. Anytime you're offered the card, just take one of them. When you're going plus cycle though, high compression cards can help a lot to mitigate the surplus shock. Returning to that idea of compression, 2-cost cards, effective powers that increase your compression, card draw and energy can all improve your deck regardless of its size and can help mitigate that shock of going positive on cycles. Something notable is that the bottom deck surplus reduction is smaller when there are fewer basics, but not larger when there are more. So this is the opposite of the bad card downsize premium, right? When there are fewer basics in your deck, you can add more cards, more quality cards, without it impacting your hands. But when your deck already sucks, adding more quality hands and going from 5 turn cycle, 6 turn cycle, 7 turn cycle doesn't actually cost you more. It's always like a flat rate. It caps out at 2 all the time. All these caps are here at 2. So the cost of just jamming extra cards into your deck when your deck already sucks is negligible. It's always the same cost. It kind of puts you in two minds, right? There's either this space over here where your deck is incredibly high quality and you've got a lot of removes and a lot of transforms on basics and bad cards, or if you've missed those basics and those transforms and your deck kind of lives in this space over here, it doesn't matter what you add to the deck, right? It doesn't really matter how long you go on the deck. It's not going to affect your expected surplus. You can just jam in as many cards as you want. It's not really going to impact your ability to play, non-basic cards. Avoid playing cards like strikes or defense. I think it is notable that there are these kind of two modes here. One where the cycle deficit, the bottom deck effect, is minimized by having a really high quality deck. And players like to end up in that space where they can add cards to their deck freely, knowing that it's not going to cost them very much because their deck is already highly powered and highly tuned. And then a lot of players also end up down in this space down here where their deck is kind of already just a value pile and they're happy to take any card that is good enough to play out during their cycle that offers some amount of scaling or offers a good matchup in the fight they expect to take. And those players can make their deck as large as they like because the cap on the bottom deck effect is outweighed even with the diminishing returns of additional card rewards up until like 50 or 60 cards. Like I haven't done the numbers exactly, but it's way, way, way off in the distance. It's kind of unfeasible that anyone could ever add enough cards to their deck where the surplus shock from the bottom deck effect outweighs the advantages of adding more cards to the deck to their surplus, even though there are severe diminishing returns. What's the opposite of just adding like a silver bullet or a piercing whale, or the opposite of adding like a prepared minus though? A remove. What impact does a remove actually have on the whole deck? This graph shows the change in surplus if you were to remove a low quality card from the deck, a red card in this paradigm. We see that the strongest positive effect is on the deck that's already in the bottom deck situation. So for a card that's at like 16 cards exactly, or 21 or 26 cards exactly, the remove is really impactful for it because it undoes that bottom deck shock. And by removing our weakest card, we're actually improving our worst hand, right? So even though when we're adding the bottom deck effect, we have a -2 to our surplus, by removing the worst card and getting back below one cycle from a remove, you actually have a +3 there. So removing a bad card and going down a cycle is more impactful than adding a good card and going up a cycle. So if you're ever in a situation where it's like, Living Wall, transform a card or remove a card, well, maybe if you have enough cards to work with, maybe remove a card is better in some circumstances. What about another remove though? Let's take a second remove. We see a second remove more than doubles this effect. Again, we have our heuristic, each remove is better than the last. This still supports that by extending the benefit of avoiding the bottom deck to effectively a +1 deck size. So now rather than just affecting 16 card decks and 21 card decks and 26 card decks with a cycle shock, we're also affecting 17 card decks and 22 card decks and 27 card decks with a positive cycle shock. Of course, this matches our game sense. Each remove is better than the last. Some decks are moved towards the reshuffle, so they'll actually have small negatives. And we can see those kind of around this territory here or this territory here. It is possible because of the relative probability of different partitions of the deck and the steepness or the flatness of the distribution of good cards through our deck, that taking cards out of our deck, even bad cards, increases the likelihood that we will need to play strikes and defense. This is what this is showing. There are lots of hands here. There are lots of deck arrangements here where a couple of removes does make it more likely that you will need to play a strike or a defend as you cycle through the deck. Obviously, it's outweighed by the quality that the remove offers to all these other deck arrangements in like removing 3 strikes or 3 defends from their cycle. And as well, don't forget that you can just draft an extra card to overcome this deficit. But, if you've ever been in like that situation where your deck is running really nicely and you're getting it very lean and efficient, and you got a couple of shops in a row, and you got a couple of card removes, or maybe you got the empty cage. Maybe you're on the silent. You've gone from your 5 basics, your 5 strikes and 5 defends, to only 3 strikes. And 5 defends and your Ascender's Bane as well. And you're at the end of the act and you have a couple of events along the act. It is possible that by removing those strikes, you actually will end up playing more defends. Now, that's not a bad thing for the Silent, right? Like the Silent can make her defends good. And so for the Silent, in a lot of circumstances, her defends are green cards and her deck actually lives somewhere over here in this territory, right? But if we are using the heuristic of just avoiding playing basics, there's a lot of circumstances where the Silent will be like somewhere like this, and removing strikes will actually make her more likely to have to play basics with her 3rd energy. Again, that 3rd energy would be a defend. She's happy with that. What about 2-cost cards though? We can incorporate 2-cost cards into this model by considering where drawing a 2-cost card would improve the surplus of the hand. So a 2-cost card, when do you actually get to play more effects with it? Well, if you draw a 2-cost card in a 2 green hand, or if you draw a 2-cost card in the 1 green hand, you do actually get to play that. It improves your surplus compared to if both of the cards cost 1. So at the surplus evaluation phase per hand, I added the term that adds +1 surplus when the hand would benefit from having a 2-cost card. So the way that integrates through the rest of it is it's proportional to the likelihood of one of the cards in the hand being a 2-cost card. Adding a 2-cost card means that there are more ways for us to draw hands that spend 2 or 3 energy on good cards, even for the same number of cards. And here's that graph. So this graph shows the same derivations, but with a 2-cost card in the green cards. So just a reminder, you count the green cards across the top, you count the red cards down the left-hand side, and the size of the deck overall is the sum of the number of green cards and the number of red cards. Each diagonal is decks of the same size. If you were to transform a bad card into a good card, you would move diagonally up and to the right. But immediately, to my eye, with this graph, I do want you to notice that we do start further down in the green space for decks with more bad cards. These numbers are all improvements on a deck with exactly the same number of good and bad cards, but all the good cards are 1 cost instead of one of them being a 2 cost. We get similar diminishing returns from good cards, but we get a much better start. We start off with a better deck. And the difference is subtle, but it is kind of clear. So this is a graph that's showing the difference, adding a 2-cost card compared to a 1-cost card. Roughly speaking, it's a plus 0.3 effect for all but the best 4-cycle decks. So, all but these really, really high quality decks over here on the top right hand corner. There's about a plus 0.3 effect quality to to the surplus of all these decks. And also notice that the effect is biggest, 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. The effect is biggest at the reshuffle. So when you would bottom deck a card, there's actually when a 2-cost card becomes best. Why? Because you have a chance to draw the 2-cost card in the new hand. High impact cards like 2 costs or 3 costs, they mitigate the bottom deck effect. We're going up to the next end cycle, has a -2 to -3 point shock on the expected surplus. And again, this matches our typical game sense. With powerful enough cards, we can often skip and try to redraw them again. When your deck has cards worth playing, you can often think to yourself, I don't want to go up to a next cycle. I would just prefer to draw my high impact cards sooner. And 2-cost cards reflect that in the fact that they do make the next cycle higher quality. They mitigate the effect of going up in deck size. Now you might ask, well, hey, in the worst decks, we said that every time you add a card to the deck, we get a better chance, we effectively get to play that. So shouldn't we, by adding a 2-cost card to the deck, shouldn't we be adding +1 to all the surpluses down the bottom? Shouldn't we get to spend more energy on non-basics? Why is it only +1/2 or +1/3? Well, it's because when you add 2 good cards to the deck, it gives you more opportunities to flatten the partition, and flatter partitions have a much higher probabilistic weight. So even though a dash in the deck, or a glacier, or a flame barrier, or a glitter stream has a bigger effect on the hands where you draw them with 2 energy to spare on a 2-cost card, if you draw this 2-cost card alongside 2 other drafted cards, well, now you're skipping another drafted card to play the 2-cost card instead. So because of the probabilities there, you only benefit from a portion of the energy that's loaded into the dash. It's still a premium though, and it's the premium that especially shows off when you do have a smaller cohort of cards to draw from, like when you are bottom decking. When you're bottom decking, more of your hands are 2 green or 1 green hands, and so a 2-cost card has more situations where it can be played alongside a 1-cost card and minimize your lost surplus. This is a hidden advantage of high compression cards. So 2-cost cards are almost like +1 draw. We'll look at draw in a moment, but they're similar to a remove. They help smooth out the reshuffle. 2-cost effects also do have diminishing returns with deck quality though. So whereas card removes get better as you take more of them, 2-cost cards get worse as you take more of them. But at least the first couple of them, the first 1 or 2 or 3 2-cost cards, effectively it's giving your deck extra card draw every time you would draw one. And maybe just to compare that to something like Pendulum. Pendulum draws you a card once every 3 turns. If you have a pair of 2-cost cards in your deck, and you have a 5-cycle deck, then that pair of 2-cost cards will increase your surplus by +1, which is similar to drawing +1 card in that 5-turn cycle. So taking a 2-cost card like Dash or Glacier or Flame Barrier can be equivalent in its impact on your ability to play powerful cards as though it was an extra card draw over the course of many turns. One of the ways to read this is that a 2-cost card in like a 4-card deck is kind of equivalent to like most of a Pendulum. All of a sudden drafting a Dash compared to drafting a Cloak and Dagger sounds pretty good, right? Would you like a Cloak and Dagger and most of a Pendulum? Or would you just like a Cloak and Dagger? Seems pretty obvious when you put it that way, right? Like that's what the Melvin style mathematical evaluation of the compression can let you do. So when can we take a curse? Well, this graph shows the expected surplus change due to adding a curse to the deck. So in this case, we're going rather than with a remove, -1 bad card, this time we're adding a bad card. For most arrangements, this effect is minimal. However, a curse might encourage you to skip a future card reward to avoid increasing the cycle. So we can see that this is a -1, or in some cases it's actually a +1. There are some deck sizes where adding a curse gives you better surplus, better net surplus, but for most of the cases here we see that there is this -0.2 or -0.3 surplus, especially to high quality decks. As your deck gets lower quality, the impact of a curse is already really low, so maybe you can consider taking a clumsy early in the run or a greed early in the run. You're already playing strikes and defense, not much is going to change, it's okay. Where we do see the big impact though is that when it does take you to like when the curse is the 16th card or when the curse is the 21st card, these are bigger shocks than if you were just to regularly go up the deck cycle because you're not even adding a good card with them. Bear in mind, earlier we were talking about the next deck shock is going to be usually -2. Well, the reason it's -2 is that it's -3 plus a good card. If you don't get that good card, it's a full -3. And that's like spending an extra 3 energy on strikes and defense. That's like getting guaranteed 1 dead hand every cycle, every time through the deck. So one of the ways to think about it, one of the ways to evaluate this is that if a curse takes you up to the next cycle, it's effectively giving you a dead hand every time you go through the deck. However, if it doesn't take you up to the next cycle, it can be mitigated by like a 2-cost card, right? So it's equivalent in negative surplus as a 2-cost card is positive to net surplus. And that matches that game sense as well, right? Like if you draw a curse with a dash or with a flame barricade or with a glacier, you're like, cool, it's fine, right? Like it's cool, I drew glacier, we're fine, we're golden. So when you're deciding on the curse, weigh up if you already have picks reserved for certain effects, like if you need the frost card and you're going to draft a frost card, or if you need an accuracy and you're going to draft an accuracy or a footwork or just a power. If you can afford to draw more cards and escape a bottom cycle deck, that's one thing going for it. But if you have these effects reserved, it maybe makes you less likely to want to take a curse, because that means that you're already taking card slots away from when you would go next cycle and effectively add a dead hand into a deck. You should also consider if you can afford to draw more cards to escape a bottom deck cycle. So one of the ways you can escape, this negative shock is just to add more cards. Like you can see here, if you have a bad deck and you take this negative shock of a cycle, well, then actually adding a curse, being bottom decking there, is so negative that adding a curse improves your surplus. So you can even just take a mediocre card. If you know what you're looking for and if you have slots available for it, and if you just know you just need to take cards, a curse is fine just to add in and then just keep picking more cards. Likewise, you can just take a curse and then just add like 3 or 4 more cards on top of that to get back to a position where you've got like a nice, smooth, flat partition. The bottom deck effect is so pronounced that much of the time a curse actually improves your expected surplus by reducing your exposure. Curses can be mitigated with card compression, such as with powers, with 2 costs, and with potions. Maybe something you can consider is that when you add a curse to your deck, you want to add a 2 cost or a power or like 3 more card rewards, or you expect that curse to cost you a potion at some point in time, because otherwise it costs you a dead hand. What about card draw though? Can you just draw through it? Bag of Preparation is interesting as it shifts the cycle breakpoints up and effectively ensures that at least turn 1 of a combat will spend all energy effectively. So we can see on this graph that the breakpoints are actually a bit harder for the same number of green cards as the reshuffle is into a worse deck. Bag of Prep moves a lot of quality cards from your second hand into your first, and moves a lot of quality cards from your third hand into your second, and so on and so forth. But by drawing so many cards in one go and eating into so much of your partition, again with the orderings all of them being even, for a Bag of Prep to not negatively impact you at some point in the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th turn, it needs to actually be a very steep partition. And we do see that here reflected in the net surplus evaluations, right? So this graph shows the surplus difference with a Bag of Preparation compared to without it. You can see that many of these deck sizes are advantaged because they're no longer decks of the bottom decking, right? They're no longer trapped in the bottom deck zone. But many of these deck arrangements are negatively affected because they went from being a good deck with a good distribution of good cards, and then they suffered by getting hit with a bottom deck situation. How do they respond to Bag of Preparation? Well, they just draft 2 more cards. It's totally fine. But certain deck sizes are advantaged and certain deck sizes are disadvantaged, and it needs, the numbers show that. Overall though, these are mostly like +1s compared to -1s, +2s compared to -0s, +3s compared to +1s, right? So like it's a whole other +2s across the board, but simply taking card rewards will just clean it up after. Just if you take Bag of Preparation, it sounds kind of silly to put it this way, but you're drawing 2 more cards, so you should draft 2 more cards. That gets you out of this situation where you're bottom decking. any of these decks, unless it takes you up a cycle. If you're already in an area where Bag of Prep is very, very strong, and you have like 22 card deck, well, Bag of Prep now puts you with a 4-turn cycle. And we can directly compare the impact of like card removes versus card draw now, right? Bag of Prep lets us see the dual relationship between removes and cards very clearly, at least for the first cycle. For the first cycle, card draw and card removes are the same to some extent. You feel like they're the same because if you draw an extra card, that's the same as not drawing a card that got removed, right? There's virtual card advantage there by not drawing a card that got removed. That's the premise of cleanse or seance or a card remove in general. However, again, when we look at the actual partitions and the probabilistic spread of different ranks of different partitions, it's not that simple. We're not just, removing a card arbitrarily from the deck order. We're removing a card at random from the deck order. And the deck orders aren't uniform in their randomness. Lower rank deck partitions are more probabilistically dense than higher rank deck partitions. And we're happy about that. That's good for it, right? But it does mean that the card draw is often worse than a card remove for the first cycle. So this deck shows the difference in expected surplus between taking 2 card removes and taking Bag of Prep. Removes perform a little better than draw, even during the first cycle. And it's not just because of the redraw. You can see that there are lots of hands here where reshuffling isn't what's impacting them here. There's no bottom deck effect, right? It's a bit all over the place because there's a lot of different numbers being compared, and they're both quite substantially different effects, and Bag of Prep changes the bottom decks compared to the 5-card hand, whereas an empty cage doesn't change when different hands get broken off for reshuffling. However, that's also why removes are better, because as we saw in the Bag of Prep graph, loading more cards into one hand doesn't necessarily make your whole deck perform better. It just makes that one turn perform better. So you're limited in upside again, and your other hands are not limited in their downside. Card removes are equally positive and negative up until the probabilistic spread of the partition. So the advantage of removes is seen most obviously in the reshuffling of deck sizes, and when a deck with removes reshuffles, the new hand is better too. That's not explaining all the effects though. Card draw on one turn more reliably caps the hand at that energy level, and when you overdraw like that, you're limiting your surplus, whereas the card removes distribute that over the entire deck. That's the reason there's a bit of a difference, and that's the reason why card removes, again, are even better than card draw the better your deck is. So maybe if you're ever in the shop and you're looking at the 200 gold card remove versus a 200 gold relic that like a pendulum, you can look at the quality of the deck. The better your deck is, the better a card remove is, right? Even at 4 or 5 or 6 cycles, a card remove could be better than a card draw. Maybe though, if your deck is like quite bad at 3 or 4 or 5 cycles, drawing 2 cards over the course of your 5 or 6 cycle deck, and most of which is bad cards, maybe that's a little bit better than a card remove, just because you get 2 of these cards here as opposed to just the 1. Let's talk about additional energy though. This table shows the increase in surplus by treating one of the green cards as a generic +1 energy card. So this card doesn't exist in the real deck. It's a Soul's Power Wisp, or a Miracle that doesn't have exhaust. It's a little bit hard to see as these graphs are, quite samey and the differences can be quite subtle. But one thing I do want to point out for you here is that we're no longer seeing zeros across the top here now. Now we're seeing positive numbers. So when the deck is sufficiently good, this deck now has expected positive surplus. It can play more cards than its energy per turn because of the addition of an energy card in the deck. Here's the gap. What you can see is that extra energy in your deck does give you better reshuffling in the same way that a 2-cost card does. And maybe you could think about an extra energy card often as just a 0-cost card, like an Anger. That's an equivalent here. It's a card that lets you play another card rather than generating an energy and playing like Pommel Strike. Maybe you could just play an Anger. And of course, this card doesn't really exist, so every energy card is going to be better than what this card is. This is just the minimal impact that one minimal energy card could do. We do see though that all of the positives that are available for decks exist up here in the top right corner. If a deck is a high enough quality, extra energy in the cards can be transformed into extra card plays. That's unsurprising. We also see that extra energy in the deck does not really have very much impact for like low quality decks, right? This is already, I think, fairly well known. People are happy to understand that if their deck is bad, adding energy to their deck doesn't necessarily make it better. I think it goes a bit beyond that. I think you do want to consider how good strikes and defends are and where you are in the run. I think there are lots of circumstances where you could even take like first pick bloodletting. I'm not against that. If we're looking at surplus, and surplus being green versus red cards, and red cards being basics, which they don't always have to be, we'll continue investigating. The best time to add energy to your deck is when your deck is already drawing more high quality cards, more green cards than it can afford to play. Makes sense to everyone. Extra energy lets you benefit more from the draft picks. So when you've already taken a lot of draft picks, if you're considering a skip, if you have the option of Wisp versus skip or bloodletting versus skip, maybe just take a bloodletting, even a second bloodletting, it's totally fine. As long as your deck can handle the damage, which most of the time they can handle the damage because it's going to save you HP by letting you play more shrug-it-offs, right? But what about an energy relic? Energy relics capture more advantage every turn, so going up in cycles presents greater advantage on the first cycle. The first shuffle through the deck. This especially lets you draft more powers to scale your output harder whilst continuing to front load output. Now, this is maybe where it starts to become somewhat apparent that energy per turn, if we aggregate that out over a 4 or a 5 or a 6 turn cycle, isn't really handled well by this kind of approach, because now, just by virtue of having 5 turns, we're saying, well, there's a +5 surplus. But I think it is actually reasonable to consider it in that way, because when you draft a deck, you're not just drafting 25 copies of Cloak and Dagger or Iron Wave, right? You're drafting a mix of finesse and footwork and inflame and powers. You're drafting a mix of powers and exhaust effects, and you're drafting a mix of card draw and high impact attacks. And if the draft comes together for you in a way that you can always be improving your deck with every card reward, well, it's a bit silly just to not take more and more and more cards. And then as you go through the first cycle of your deck, you have more powers to continue scaling, and you have more exhaust cards to continue front loading. And you do get to benefit from that energy every single turn. Ideally, for most decks being in the second cycle, it won't matter what they're doing, right? Because they will have scaled up second cycle to match whatever the boss is asking of them. So maybe something to think about with an energy relic is that on the first cycle through your deck, it's going to let you block incoming damage instead of face tanking whilst you deploy your powers. Maybe that's a way to minimally assume that your energy will be useful and save you HP. Deck size, ending deck size in a run, I think is primarily a function of your power density. I think that you should be considering how many powers you can add to your deck and then adding extra block density to supplement that. And so from my perspective, and what I would recommend to most players, is that, yeah, you do want to weigh in the fact that a 4th energy over 5 turns or 6 turns as you play out all the powers in your deck gets more beneficial as it takes more turns for you to cycle through. And here's that gap. This chart shows the surplus improvement due to adding a 4th energy. You can see the extra energy amplifies deck quality, and going above 30 cards can still have very good returns. So this matches our game sense as well. With more energy, we can play the draft, quote unquote, looser. We can just take more speculative powers. We can just take more speculative cards that are worth playing. And why does a 4th energy not really help very much when our deck has a lot of basics? Because this metric, this evaluation, surplus, if we're counting red cards as basics, having a 4th energy will just let you play an extra basic. And so that could be 5 block, or it could be 6 damage from a strike. It could still be good output, but from this particular metric, if we're counting them as good cards, green cards versus red cards, the question is always how much energy can I spend on green cards, not what is my output in this kind of evaluation. Kind of the opposite side of the spectrum though, whereas an extra energy improves your output substantially if you have enough green cards in your deck to want to play. A 6th card per turn allows weaker decks to reach maximum output. You can see how even decks with more red cards than green cards can have positive colorings down here, right? Like you've got all these these points here where you're above -3 surplus by drawing a 6th card per turn. I mentioned this in my previous video about rare designs and how rares like Machine Learning and Tyranny and Call of the Void act as like pseudo relics to have a similar effect like Pael's Blood with Innate, so that you can snapshot a bad deck. And I said that the mathematics was quite complicated to try and show it. Well, here is the mathematics to show it. You can see here, as we take the difference, that when you add a 6th card to your deck, there's a slight negative to the surplus of your deck, depending on if you get caught in the bottom deck situation. Because remember, we're going from 5 card hands for reshuffling. Every 5th card is a reshuffle, a bottom deck situation. We're going from that to every 6th card being a bottom deck situation. But as your deck gets sufficiently large, the factors overlap, and the 6th card per turn just becomes positive for every single deck arrangement above, above 24 cards, above 25 cards. So a 6 card per turn is strictly positive for every deck arrangement above 25 cards, and it's mostly positive for most deck arrangements that aren't exactly like 12 cards big, 12 or 18 cards. And you can enjoy all the benefits just by drafting one more card. Drafting one more card or 2 more cards, again, just like with Bag of Preparation, accounts for the extra draw and lets you have good quality cards to draw without going into, without steepening your partition curve. We can also see that this has the biggest impact on the bad decks. Like some of these here, this is +3. If your deck is somewhat bad, it's like a +3. Well, what's a +3 surplus? A +3 surplus is equivalent to never drawing a dead hand, right? So if you had a hand that was all strikes and all defends, and you spent 3 energy on strikes and defends, that would be a -3 hand. So +3 is like skipping that hand. So aside from the very, very best decks that basically can't draw dead ever, a 6th card per turn will let us play 2 to 3 more high quality cards throughout our cycle. And maybe this is a good time as well to say, green cards don't need to be good and red cards don't need to be bad. We can work these out any number of ways. Let's say, for example, we consider green cards as powers or status effects like weak and vuln, effects that you only have a few of. Say you had 5 powers and 3 weak and vuln effects in the deck, so you had 8 green cards, and then amongst that you had like 18 other cards. Well, that would put your power and your status distribution down here. Now you can play 3 more powers per cycle, or 3 more status cards per cycle, because card draw, especially an extra card per turn, in the numbers equivalent to saving turns from your deck reshuffle, has a much higher impact on card types that are the minority in your deck, and powers are probably going to be the minority. Continuing from that, we don't need to consider green cards good and red cards bad, or green cards drafted cards and red cards non-basic. Let's try splitting it into scaling and front-loading. In a hallway fight, you can treat your front-loaded effects as green and scaling as red. Think about all those situations where you draw a hand with a couple of powers in it, and you don't get to play like your block cards or your damage cards, and you can't get a kill check, you can't get a lethal check on like a chompy book, and you lose max HP. As with all things, you have to strike a balance here, like how many hands full of powers and low quality cards can you tolerate in a hallway fight where you do need to kill things quickly. -3 means you're missing 3 energy worth of front-loaded cards over the course of your hallway fight. Now, thankfully, the actual minority of scaling cards in the game makes it quite difficult to get into a situation where you're drawing significantly too many powers and significantly too many scaling effects compared to front-loaded damage and front-loaded output. But this is why I say that you probably should let your power density lead the rest of your deck construction. If you were to draft more powers, you probably need to take other cards to try and keep up with those. In a hallway fight, drafting a power puts you down on this curve, right? It drops you down one place. And so in a lot of circumstances, you probably need to pick up like 2 other cards to make up for that. And we can consider that the other way around as well, right? Like you probably want to play some number of your powers for scaling, even in hallway fights. how many scaling effects do you get to play if you prioritize front-loaded output? What if the fight is so challenging that you have to use all your front-loaded output where you get it, and you just have to, play your powers around that whenever you get the opportunity to? That's another way to read this graph. What if you treat block effects as green, and you go for a high block strategy, and then you're weaving damage amongst your block? The surplus is how much energy you expect to spend on non-block effects in that circumstance. So just want to emphasize there are lots of ways to read this graph depending on how you partition the cards into red and green, not just good and bad. Against a boss, you could consider scaling effects and first cycle high impact effects in the green and all other effects in the red. So then you could ask the question, how many cards are we playing without scaling, right? How many of our effects are we playing regardless of when we get our powers down? This is the energy that we're spending that's not compression efficient, because it all comes before our powers, it all comes before our powers are deployed. So your cards like Backstab and Impervious and Calculated Gamble and Boot Sequence, you put them in the green alongside with your powers, and then you get to see with all other effects in red, well, how much of your energy is being effectively like unpowered here. How much of the energy that you're expending needs to wait or wants to wait until you've got your bulk up down. And you can see from that perspective that bigger decks tend to do it better, because every time you add a power or every time you add an exhaust card, it pushes you to the right. But then you put yourself at risk of overdrawing on the powers as well. And so you probably need to add a couple of front-loaded effects, even if you can't get them with exhaust, just any suitable card or like a 2-cost card, right? And so that pushes you down the curve as well. And so where you want to end up is maybe roughly in one of these sweet spots, where you've got a very slight negative surplus, but you can continue to play through additional turns and continue to scale up your deck as you play through additional turns. You're still not spending very much energy on inefficient, uncompressed card plays, but you're not putting yourself at risk of overdrawing on powers and just completely bricking hands. But know this though, that this graph isn't down the diagonal line. It's not strictly down the center, because the underlying curve is kind of exponential there. We can take the same reasoning for status effects as well. If you have a 4-cycle deck, setting green to 4 shows you how much energy you get to spend on other effects if you treat the statuses as must plays, right? So let's count 4 status cards in the 4-cycle deck, which is down here in this bound here. And so we have -8 through -8. So if you have 4 status cards in the 4-cycle deck, you get to spend 8 energy on non-status cards. That makes sense. Let's look a little bit closer there. With about 5 in a 5, you get to spend 10 energy on non-status effects. That of course completely checks out, because if we want Weak to be applied for 4 turns in a row and we have 4 copies of Defy, we need to play all 4 copies of Defy to maintain that Weak on every single turn. So let's look at the deck. Let's use all this to evaluate the deck. This is a deck from Logical Rough, posted to the Reddit. It did win. It says the Ironclad tried his best, but it wasn't enough. But it did actually win. That's just what it says when the Architect kills you. It's quite a fast run. Lots of potion slots. Started off with a Silken Tress for a Perfected Strike with Glad. Picked up the Stone Sword. Picked up Nunchucks and Tungsten Rod and Permafrost. With the belt, picked up extra coffers from Ouroboros, probably thinking at this point that they could maybe pick up the Frond from another Pipe. But even better than the Frond, they picked up a Lizard Tail as well. After the Lizard Tail, they picked up the Tri-Boomerang from Tanks. And then even better than all that again, Pantograph and then Ornamental Fan. So all of the defensive capacity of this deck is baked into the potions, baked into the Tungsten Rod and the Lizard Tail, and then the Ornamental Fan and the healing from the Pantograph. The deck has a lot of card draw over multiple pommel strikes, a Battle Trance, an Offering, the Pendulum, any extra card draw from the potions, if there are Swift potions, or if there are Snecko potions. And you can see here in 33 cards, 18 of these cards are attacks. It's very, very attack-centric. 19 if we count 1-2 punch. And in terms of block, it's mostly face tanking, right? You've got the Tungsten Rod, you've got a lot of max HP, 80 max HP, and then the Lizard Tail as well. And you've got healing between the boss fights. You can afford to take an extra 25 damage for the Pantograph. When you do want to play some block cards, there are these 2 Imperviouses in there to get it done. There's a Defend Plus, and there's a 3 more Defends. There must have been some random upgrades along the way. But there are no additional block cards in this deck except for Impervious. Including extra card draw, this deck can spend all of its per turn energy on playing all attacks almost all of the time with a net surplus of negative 0.4. So it only spends half an energy on defend on average. Can spend more if it wants to. You know, if the clad wants to play the Impervious, they can. But if they just want to play only attacks, on average, half an energy would not go towards attacks. Let's look at it a little bit closer though. What about the extra energy? The deck has 5 draw effects, offering Battle Trance, Pommel Strike Plus, and then the Pendulum as well. But the deck also has 5 energy effects, 2 Bloodlettings, an Offering, a Nunchuck, and a Bread, as well as Glam, and 3 Instinct enchantments, and then a 1-2 punch as well. There's lots of ways to get virtual compression out of this energy on top of the amount of energy simply being generated. Including all the extra energy in card draw, this deck can spend 7 turns worth of energy, almost all of it on attacks in 5 turns. So it's a +2 turn acceleration on all of those attacks. So I'm not surprised at that one, because it can absolutely blast bosses dead just by playing Bloodletting and Twin Strike and Perfected Strike. You know, it doesn't matter that those cards aren't, you know, the typical broken cards. When you just play more of them and you just have that much surplus, it doesn't really matter. That said though, you can see that there is this tear asunder here as well. So between the Bloodlettings, between the Offering, there is this instinct tear asunder to come in and deal 12 times X somewhere along the way. But now that we've discussed all these things about surplus and we've looked at, you know, a bit of a surplus evaluation in action, let's go back to what we need. As mentioned, we need about 12 defense output or 4 defense per energy for a typical deck to match the block demands of the bosses. Weak can let us bring it down from 4 defense per energy to roughly 3 defense per energy, and carrying over and per turn block can help bring that down further. So one of the ways that we can effectively give ourselves extra energy is just by creating some block along the way to reduce the demand on our block compression per energy. You know, Psy is a block card, is I suppose the meme there from Riptide Labs, and card draw can let you combine those high output turns, and deficits in scaling can be made up in HP and potions. So if we do want to block a really big attack, card draw will help us draw those effects. Max HP will let us, you know, miss, and potions will let us miss as well. But all these relics, all these effects actually help us improve our capacity against the bosses in a way that just regular card compression can't. So Dark Shackles removing strength, especially from the test subject, or especially from the Queen, who has multi-attack both on the Queen and on the Chestling. Boot Sequence being a 0 cost effect, and obviously effects like Adrenaline that just give you raw output. But also a lot of your common relics, right? Like your Lantern and your Gorget. A lot of uncommon relics like your Intimidating Helm and your Permafrost and your Boat thingies. Of course, your ancient relics like the Psy and your Razor Tooth and your Rainbow Ring that give you scaling on your cards by either upgrading all of your cards, you know, or by just improving your strength in your decks as you play out your powers. Paper Crane gets a mention here as well by making your weak effectively stronger. So Paper Crane takes weak from a minus 25% damage to minus 40% damage. So it takes you from needing, you know, roughly 12 defense worth of compression to something like 7 defense worth of compression over your turn. So something like Paper Crane allowing weak to become that strong compared to weak being, you know, minus 3 defenses worth of compression to minus 5 defenses worth of compression. It's effectively saving you 2 energy by upgrading weak that well. Or it's saving you 2 defenses worth of energy. If your energy is better, if your compression is higher, Paper Crane is a little bit weaker, but it's covering that gap really, really well. Let's look at some specifics though. So talking about the Queen applies Bound and then 99 Vulnerable, Frail and Weak, and then buffs the Amalgam every turn. So this fight demonstrates the impact of those debuff effects and the rhythm of the multi-hits and the inevitability of spiky scaling from the Amalgam. What I've done here is I've graphed the damage that is actually coming in from the Amalgam here in blue, and then added those extra multipliers so you can see how much they impact you. So the Vulnerable, it just adds 50% there. And then with Frail, it adds an extra 50% to the amount of block that you actually need to produce. And then there's a number here for the compression. And so this is the green line here at the top. This is the amount of defense that you need to play to block the attack. So you can see it goes from like 2 to 1 defend, but then right up to, you know, almost 6, and then up to 8, and then up to 10 defense worth of card plays. How much can you actually play with your basic deck and your energy? It's somewhere like around here, right? So the game is effectively asking you for twice what you could output, and then it's asking you for 3 times what you can output, then it's asking you for 4 times what you can output. So you do need to scale up alongside that. But like we discussed earlier as well, when it comes to effects like Frail, you know, Frail doesn't affect your Gorget, Frail doesn't affect your Thigh, Frail doesn't affect your flat block creation effect, your flat block output. So although the game is asking you for quite a severe amount of compression here, you don't necessarily want to answer it all with just more dexterity. A lot of it you want to answer with things like Child of the Stars, or Pillars of Creation, or with Rage, or with any other effects that aren't affected by dexterity and also aren't affected by Frail. Even though it's very easy to look at your deck and say, I don't need any other block effects, I have 3 copies of Footwork, they do have different coverage, and it is really important, especially against fights like the Queen, to take that kind of variety in your block strategy, the variety in your blocking layers. Maybe that's a guide video to make down the line, all the different layers of block and how you should incorporate them into your deck. I think I probably will make that down the line. What are we doing though? We're trying to define something called smoothness. We've got this value called net surplus. We've got a lot of other ideas about surplus. What do we want it to do? We want it to have some urgency to it. If a deck has inevitability after many turns and many reshuffles, that shouldn't matter. It matters what the deck can do now in its first cycle. It should be draw and energy positive. Card draw and energy improves the smoothness of your deck. It should be cycle negative. More hands per cycle reduces the smoothness. And it should be output density positive. Higher compression and higher density should improve your smoothness. It should respect relics. If you have relics contributing scaling or flat output, that should also improve your smoothness. And it should respect scaling and reshuffles as well. Smoothness should respond to changing compression density over your turns and over your reshuffles. We can actually incorporate most of these ideas just into net surplus by itself. So smoothness, the smoothness term here, will probably be mostly a function of net surplus, maybe with some extra additions. And here is a form that I was able to land on. This is just an example of an estimation of a deck's smoothness. There are lots of ways to construct this. I did toy around with a couple of different constructions that I didn't quite like the look of. But what this is, it's a static term here over on the left. P, the number of powers, plus RS, the number of scaling relics that you have, divided by K0, the number of hands it takes to draw through the first cycle of the deck, or turns that it takes to reshuffle the first cycle of the deck. And then you have a net sum here over all the cycles, so it should be roughly a converging sequence. You know, we would expect, or I would expect, the vast majority of these terms to approach 0 and get sequentially smaller. But the expected surplus of that cycle for your cards with suitable compression, plus the number of flat output relics you have, and then this expected surplus is weighted according to the sequential product of the number of hands it takes to go through each cycle of the deck. So this isn't a net sum, you know, summing over all the thousands of cycles that you could take a deck through. You know, the fights are going to end by like turn 10 or turn 12 most of the time, right? So really, this is only ever going to be like 2 terms or 3 terms, just written to capture all the terms. But you would take the first cycle of the deck plus your flat relics, then divide that out by 1. And then you'll take the second cycle of the deck plus your flat relics, and then you'll divide that out by the number of hands you've already played. And then you'll take the third cycle of the decks and your flat relics and divide that out by that number times the number of hands you've played in the third cycle. So the third term is smaller than the second term, which is smaller than the first term. And maybe just to unpack that a little bit closer. So for this estimation, P is the number of powers and RS is the number of scaling relics. RF is the number of flat output relics. And SIC is the surplus on the ith cycle of the high compression cards. You would take the high compression cards as colored green. K0 is the number of hands it takes to get through the first deck cycle. And KJ is the number of turns it takes to reshuffle for the jth cycle. And what we do is we take j as equal to I minus 1, and then we add a +1 term there. So we get the full weight of the first cycle through the deck, the surplus of the first cycle, and then we get some portion, maybe a fifth or a sixth or a seventh, depending on how many turns it takes to cycle through the deck, of the second cycle surplus. And then we'll get, maybe a 50th or a 60th or a 70th of the third portion through the deck, and then maybe 1/250th or 1/300th of the fourth cycle through the deck. So it does diminish really, really quickly. Does this need to be constructed in this way? Absolutely not. This is a very complicated kind of malaise of different terms. There's so many different ways to try and estimate these things. This is just a way that looked good to me and made sense to my head and isn't too disagreeable. And maybe just to give you another example here of how to implement it, this is a deck list from Elegant Poet, again posted to the Reddit. The Regent made it to the top. Let's count up those different effects in the deck. Let's count up those different terms that are being weighted into the smoothness equation here. I've got 33 cards. Our K0 is 6 hands to cycle through the first cycle of the deck. 6 powers, 3 scaling relics. We have the Happy Flower giving us energy, and energy is scaling according to energy compression. We have the Daughter of the Wind giving us block per attack, and we have the Ornamental Fan giving us block per attacks as well. We have 5 flat output relics, the Popper, the Teapot, the Vulnerable from the Bag of Marbles, the Energy from the Lantern, and we have the Dex and the Strength from the Rouge as well. There's 15 high compression cards through the first cycle of this deck, and if we take the expected surplus of those high compression cards, that's -4.2, 15 green cards into 33 cards, and it's also a 6-card hand. There is a Tyranny Plus in here as well. So the estimated smoothness over the first cycle is +4. It can choose almost any perfect second cycle and play out every card, because we're changing the deck quite a lot with Tyranny and with Begone, and with additional cards to the deck, like with Quasar. And if we were just to take a naive approach and say, well, let's just take out the strikes and the defends on the second cycle with our Tyranny and with our Charge and our Begone and things like that, the second cycle of cards is roughly a +3.5, and then the third cycle is pretty much washed out by the size of the deck. We're unlikely to reach a third cycle before the fight is over. And so we'll say that the smoothness is about +9 for 3 cycles. Now, this is a new metric. It's a bit of an estimate. I've toyed around with it a little bit. Is +9 what you need to win the game? Maybe less. Maybe +5 is enough. Maybe +0 is enough. I don't know yet. I'm going to try to check this out a lot more with my own decks. But the main purpose of a metric like this is that we can quantify something so that we can order them, not necessarily to give breakpoints or to say, oh, what's the value of this, that, the other, or how much surplus do you need? No, the value is in evaluating when net surplus is changing, and we do have a tool for that now. Let's assess the reflections event. In the reflections event, doubling the deck sends our net surplus out many cycles along the red-green slope line. It also doubles all your enchantments and exhaust cards. So if your first cycle is strong, you can improve your overall smoothness, right? So those exhaust cards and your enchantment cards with glam and things like that, they are overtuned compared to typical cards, and just getting more copies of them will make your deck better, even if it comes at doubling your deck. Likewise, the reflections event can double your powers. So you can also improve your compression as those powers are deployed as well. All these impacts match our game sense. When we have powerful, reliable effects that solve the turn while letting us scale, doubling the deck improves both our first cycle and our second cycle compression through exhaust effects, as well as exhausting effects that we might even reshuffle, as well as scaling effects and powers that we can continue to play out. We get more apparitions, we get more genetic algorithms, we get more footworks, we get more innate cards like Tyranny. Doubling also adds bad luck, and we know that bad cards are more impactful on surplus than good cards. So surplus is likely to be negative without cards like Adrenaline to outweigh it. So if you're doubling effects like Adrenaline in your deck, that's probably going to outweigh the bad luck. However, we should remember that scaling and compressing our energy can even bring strikes and defends above the threshold where we're willing to play them. They can be good enough to be worth our energy. And the player can also draw and play powers before other effects, meaning that card draw can mitigate the key downside of bad luck. Card draw makes it more likely to run into bad luck, but it also mitigates the main downside, which is that you expose yourself to more potential hands where there's only strikes and defense. But even with a bad deck, doubling can let you scale until every second cycle hand is a good hand, right? Like if you can get defense to be worth playing by doubling a footwork or doubling a prowess or doubling a bulk up, that means that your second deck cycle, every defense hand could be worth it. Shattering can even offer you the better half as well. There are more upsides here. Consider shattering the mirror with Egg or with Fresnel Lens. The new half is actually the better one. All of your cards get Nimble, all of your cards get upgrades. If you have other effects like Book of Five Rings or Lucky Fish or Eternal Feather or Darkstone Periapt or Dragon Fruit with a Lucky Fish, the meta scaling can be absurd due to the doubling. Darkstone Periapt doesn't just give you max HP for the bad luck, it also gives you max HP for your Clumsy, and for your Ascender's Bane, and for your Greed, and for your Bing Bong, right? So you can get a lot of max HP with any of these effects out of doubling, and what do we say that max HP is good for? Max HP is good for insurance against dead hands. So if the concern is that doubling with the mirror is going to draw you dead hands, well, you're kind of covered for that base, but just by giving you more max HP as well, right? On the topic of Bing Bong, let's compare Bad Luck as a similar to Curse of the Bell. Both of these curses let you trade, quote, consistency for power. Bad Luck amplifies your deck's strengths, whereas Curse of the Bell provides new strengths with relic effects. But all of these effects make it worth doubling. All of these effects make it much more tolerable to double your deck and to let yourself scale out significantly further just by having way more powers to play. Tyranny or any other card draw effects, more quality powers that you want to play. Any upfront high output exhaust cards like Apparition or like Impervious or like Genetic Algorithm or even just like Boot Sequence can be good enough to make doubling your deck extremely good. It doesn't even need to make you worse at hallway fights as well, right? Like one of the considerations might be that if you double your deck, now it's harder to fight hallway fights because you've got a lot of powers to contend with, and it's difficult to find like your AoE effects, right? Because now your deck is twice the size. Well, if you have something like a Backstab, or if you have something like a Mind Blast, doubling gives you more of those. So wherever your deck is strong, doubling your deck makes it twice as strong there. And the game has so many synergies and so many breakpoints that usually doubling along some axis gives you more than double the payoff. So in that sense, doubling is usually going to be good so long as your deck has anything worth doing. Let's round all this up though. Thank you for watching through a very, very long presentation and entertaining a lot of strange ideas. Let's look at these heuristics that we gathered along the way here though. What are some takeaways of analyzing density and smoothness and compression and ideas like net surplus and permutations like this? Well, one, we want to manage our cycles carefully. Cards that you don't draw until you reshuffle second cycle, they were effectively discarded. If you can avoid going up to 21 or 22 cards for a mediocre effect, it probably is worth it. That is a time I would say maybe consider skipping. However, if going up to 21 or 22 cards means putting a good power in your deck or putting a strong 2 cost effect in your deck, that can be worth it. Mitigate your dead shuffles. A curse is outweighed by 3 card picks or a decent draw effect, but it still impacts your scaling. Just like we talked about where powers need to lead the way for the size of your deck and power density needs to be what you build the rest of your deck around, if you are adding curses to your deck, well, you're going to need extra powers to mitigate that decrease in the density. You don't want a curse to eat into the budget that you have for dead draws in the hallway fight that should be going to powers to help you scale. Acknowledge the card remove breakpoints. Once there are fewer basics than cards per turn, you probably won't spend energy on basics ever again, alright? So if you're looking at your deck and you're saying, hey, I have Pael's Blood, I draw 6 cards a turn, I'm down to like 4 defends and a strike, do I need to remove this last strike? It feels great to remove that last strike. It can do a lot for the numbers, but in terms of your net surplus, in terms of your likelihood to ever spend energy on a strike again, it doesn't make any difference. You are never going to play that strike just because you are already drawing 6 cards a turn. And those numbers apply too if it's 5 cards a turn and 4 basics, you know? Now, does that strike being in your deck mean you will have to spend energy on something else, like a power at some point, like another weak card that's similar to a strike, like a draft pick that you took early? Yeah, maybe it can still be worth removing a strike for that circumstance. But if you're happy with your effects and you want to deploy all your powers and you know how you're spending your energy and you already have, fewer basics and fewer curses than you have hand size, the likelihood that removing an extra curse or removing an extra strike actually changes any of the turns you play for the rest of the run is very marginal. Somewhere between marginal and like infinitesimal, honestly. Mixed output cards, as always, I'll spruik them up. When you have fewer card removes, cards with mixed output disproportionately improve your density and smoothness, and the same is true of 2-cost plus cards. When you're going plus cycle, cards with higher energy costs disproportionately improve your average output and smoothness. So what does that mean? If you can take cards that cost more energy and give you both damage and block, or scaling and block, or damage and scaling, or some combination of different kinds of output, you should just slam dunk them. Windmill slam them, right? Dash, Flame Barrier, Equilibrium, Bulwark. These cards give you multiple output types and let you spend all of your energy doing it. And especially when your deck is bad, or when you're adding deficits to your deck by going, plus cycles, they can mitigate a lot of the downsides. Also, respect the exhaust premium. High compression cards with exhaust enjoy a double premium. They complement your powers. Not only are they worth playing before you're scaling, you don't need to draw them again after you've scaled. One of the ways to read a card that has exhaust is that you only get to use it once. And maybe you should draft a card that you get to use multiple times instead so that you can, draw it on the redraw. However, that's the opposite of what you're thinking. You're thinking of exhaust as a downside. Exhaust is an upside. Even on extremely good cards, exhaust is probably an upside. Because unless you're abusing the discard pile with things like Grave Blast or Hologram or Dredge, or unless you're putting a card back on top of your deck with something like Nostalgia, the way to construct a deck to scale to the late game is that you will be scaling up your powers, and you don't need these hyper overtuned exhaust cards on the second cycle of your deck once your powers are deployed. The advantage of having those above rate cards is watered down really substantially by playing powers and just giving yourself as many above rate cards as you possibly can. And those cycles are important. Going from a 4 or a 5 or a 6 cycle deck is similar to adding like 2 basics to your deck. If you go to a 4th or a 5th or a 6th cycle with a bad card, like with a bad curse, it's equivalent to adding 3 basics to your deck. So you do really want to respect the number of cycles that it takes to reshuffle your deck, especially when your deck is already, close to the starter deck. But when do you want to add more cards? Well, when you can add more powers. Effective power density of 20% or above, and by effective I mean when you include all your card draw like Pendulum and Battle Trance and things like that. Effective power density of 20% or above will let you play at a power each turn through the first cycle and maximally expose you to your energy compression as early as possible in the combat. But while you're still playing with front-loaded cards, curses can be okay. If a curse gets you closer to a full cycle, it can increase your surplus. Like, the curse could be good for your deck as it currently is. They still don't help with density in the long run, but potentially in the long run as well, once you have enough card draw and you have enough energy. The effect of a curse is mitigated and your net surplus is still very positive regardless of the existence of one curse in your deck. The most a curse can ever be is -1, right? Unless it's, unless it's like normality or something. But if you have a curse that's -1 on the first cycle but never comes up again, like Poor Sleep or like Clumsy or like any of your curses that have Ethereal like Folly, removing a strike can be higher priority than removing that card because you get to enjoy the benefits of the second cycle and the reshuffle even more. But when should you double your deck? Additional energy and card draw, innate cards, high first cycle compression cards, low second cycle compression, all promote shattering. The better your first cycle through the deck is, if you have lots of Impervious or Backstab or Blade Dance or lots of effects that exhaust the first time you use them. If your second deck cycle is looking a little bit suspect, if you can't really scale into it, you should be doubling. Even if you don't have any powers that you want to double, just by doubling your front-loaded cards with exhaust, you still benefit quite a lot. If you have any additional energy or draw, like if you have Adrenaline or if you have Big Bang or any effects like that, doubling gives you access to multiple of those in your deck, and you do get to benefit from them. Again, you do get to benefit from them twice. You can play an Adrenaline on turn 2, and then you can play an Adrenaline on turn 4 as well. And even though it's not going to increase the per turn effect, it is going to increase how much you can compress into those 4 turns. And likewise, if you have any innate cards, it'll just give you another copy of that innate card in your opening hand, so you can just deploy that straight away. And how should you be treating energy? You should be thinking roughly that energy is multiplicative. Value energy more when your cards are better and when you want to play more non-basic cards. Energy complements your compression. The better your scaling, the better your energy compression, the more value energy can give you, right? If you have a lot of cards in hand and your cards are worth an average of 3 defense, well then every extra energy is worth 3 defense. But draw is the other side of that, the complementary side of that. It's additive. Value card draw more when your cards are worse and when you have fewer non-basics. Draw complements everything. Draw complements having a bad deck. Draw complements deploying your powers. Draw complements cycling your deck faster. Card draw, even card draw that you need to pay energy for, like Acrobatics, has a lot of upsides once you consider that you don't want to play basic cards. And even sometimes they have extra upsides, like triggering Sly or something like that. Maybe the hardest piece of card draw to get your head around is something like Prophecy, which spends 2 energy to draw 7 cards. I'm not quite sure where that fits into like a character profile yet. I'll work it out. Maybe it's with Convergence or something, right? But like, typically speaking, if you were to spend 1 energy on card draw, or if you were to add card draw to another effect, like a backflip or to a Shrug It Off or to like a Pommel Strike, you're very, very, very happy to take that effect. And especially because extra card draw can reduce the number of turns it takes you to cycle and get you out of a bottom deck situation. Often adding a card with +2 card draw, like adding a backflip to your deck, can improve your deck cycling as well and get you out of a bottom deck shock situation. But here we go. We're here at the end now. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate this is a very long and dense and somewhat rambly video. There was a lot of numbers and a lot of calculations, and it's not always clear how to analyze these things, and I don't always explain myself very quickly, so thank you for coming along for the ride. I said at the start that I was hoping to introduce you to a bunch of ideas that were quite impenetrable and give you answers for things that are quite difficult to try and answer just through gameplay or just naively, and I hope I did answer those questions, like when is it safe to take a curse, how many powers should you be drafting, when should you be doubling your deck, how early can you take energy, how early can you take acrobatics, questions like that, right? Like I hope that this video did answer all of those questions with the explanation that there are definitely opportunities to do all of those things in the game. Especially if you come from the perspective of doing these things instead of taking another drafted card or instead of taking a basic. I suppose everything here is in comparison to basics, right? And sometimes you just play basics and that's totally fine. I know Pael has a couple of videos, or maybe like a video per character, where Pael's won the game with a basic deck. So, maybe this is all over analysis for a deck that you don't actually need to play. You can just play basics. But this is also, somewhat of a personal video in the sense that I've played card games for a very long time, and I've had these questions rattling around at the back of my brain for as long as I can remember. And I've just felt for the longest time that a lot of my learning and a lot of my knowledge about these kinds of topics, like deck arrangement and deck ordering and deck permutations and the impact of dead cards in your deck and in your hand, have always been answered with heuristics, or always been answered with emotion, I know the dead card is dead because I needed to top deck Wrath of God and I drew something else instead, I got a feels bad moment, and that that changed my evaluation of a card, that changed my evaluation of how willing I was to put a quote-unquote dead card with utility in my deck. So yeah, so I've wanted to get to the bottom of these numbers for a very long time, and just never really found the opportunity to, and discrete mathematics being one of my weaker subjects as they go. You're thinking to yourself, God, which mathematics subject isn't this guy weak at? Like, he can't count, he can't do geometry, he's bad at discrete, stats and probability. Yeah, I live in the probability world. But yeah, I wanted to answer these questions for a very long time myself. I hope that this video is, interesting for you in exploring these topics. Unfortunately, these numbers don't really translate to many contexts outside of Slay the Spire. Or perhaps Netrunner as the runner, because 3 energy per turn and 3 clicks per turn is kind of equivalent. And you saw that a lot of these ideas were borrowed from Netrunner, so that can go along quite well. Any questions or any comments or any clarifications, do chuck them down below, and I'll be happy to get back to you. I hope you're enjoying Slay the Spire 2. I can spend a lot more time playing the game now, I hope. And with all that said, I'll let you get back to it. Have a great day. All the best. Ciao.